Groups that are allied with Iran, primarily Hezbollah and Lebanon, have accumulated a certain level of military strength that they're no longer intimidated by Israel. Some of what I might say today might be outside of the bounds of what we usually hear in mainstream discourse. That is only true in an American context. I don't think we've ever tried meaningful pressure on Israel. Before October 7th, Gaza has been an open-air prison. There was a young Palestinian child holding the hand of his mother and of his grandmother, and the grandmother is waving a white flag, and they're walking perfectly, obviously not posing any threat. An Israeli sniper takes out the grandmother, the child goes running off. No accountability for that kind of instance.
This is really crazy. What the fuck are you guys doing?
The Israeli argument is, no, we said fine, we're gonna give you a Palestinian state, but when you look at the maps of what was offered, it's basically Swiss cheese.
Is this a land dispute or is this a moral question?
I don't think that those are mutually exclusive in this case. When you talk about who started it, the people who's denying freedom to another people is by definition the aggressor, because that's the dynamic between them.
Omar Baddar, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Dude, glad to have you. Let me ask, it does not seem like we are getting any closer to a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, and it seems like things might even be heating up now in the north with Lebanon. Do you think this war is going to spread?
I think it is very likely that this war is going to spread. But if I can set up a little bit of context before we dive deeper into the topic, is to say that there's something paradoxical happening in that Palestine and Israel more broadly is one of the most covered topics in our media discourse, and yet one of the least understood. And that's in large part because the quality of that coverage is incredibly terrible. And there is a quote by Noam Chomsky that I like, who was talking about how you control thought to some extent. And it's about controlling the range of the debate, setting the parameters and the limits to it, and then encouraging a lot of lively argument and disagreement, even more inflammatory disagreement within that range. So the audience gets the sense that they are getting a real debate about the topic, when in reality, they're getting an extremely small slice of it under the impression that free thought is going on. And yet certain views that are beyond that spectrum are immediately dismissed as kooky. And I suspect that this is a problem on a wide range of issues, right? Domestic issues, whatever. There's like the Republican point of view, the Democratic point of view. There's an argument about it. When it comes to American foreign policy, we don't have really a wide range of debate. It is effectively the same policy, regardless of who's in charge. Trump being an exception. We can get into that also at some point. But American policy on this question does not make sense. It is completely out of sync with the values that we profess. And as a result, media discourse on it is devoid of any context, and therefore people can't make sense of what they're seeing apart from knowing that they're seeing something that is obviously horrible and tragic and violent, without being able to make more sense of it. And so I would suggest that even though some of what I might say today might be outside of the bounds of what we usually hear in mainstream discourse, that is only true in an American context, and that a lot of what I would say today, if you say it outside the United States, it's practically self-evident, and I'm happy to back it with a lot more detail as well. So just setting that as a context and saying, this war is very likely going to spread because the United States has a broken relationship with Israel. And it's a dynamic in which we are the patron state. We provide Israel with nearly unlimited military funding, unlimited diplomatic support, billions upon billions of dollars. No country receives as much military funding from the United States like Israel does. Diplomatically, the US keeps intervening at the United Nations, vetoing an incredible amount of UN resolutions to try to shield Israel from international accountability. And that created a climate in which Israel can do whatever it wants. And Israel is not on a healthy path. Israel is on a destructive path. And by allowing them to behave however they want, imposing a rule over Palestinians now for decades in which they rule Palestinians without granting them any rights, no chance for a state, no chance for equal rights to Israelis. It's just perpetually subject under military occupation and apartheid. That is a recipe for violence. And we've seen the outcome of that. We've seen violence explode at different times, most recently in October and everything that followed. And American policy has yet to change. It's still a carte blanche for Israel to do whatever it wants. And Israel is just moving towards further and further regional escalation. And I think that things are moving in a really, really dangerous direction at this point.
All right, so we will certainly get in and begin teasing out the setting of the stage in terms of how we got here. I think a lot of conversations get bogged down there. So first I want to start with, especially for my audience who really wants to understand how does the world work? How do things like this play out? How does this impact me? Which is something I think that would be really interesting to hear you address. But we will certainly go there. I've actually mapped out what I think are your base assumptions, which we talked about off camera, but it'll be good for me to see if I'm close. But what will be the mechanism of escalation here? How do you see this playing out?
So we have a dynamic right now in which Israel is insistent on a victory that can't be achieved within reasonable proportion in Gaza. They said that they are going to forcibly destroy Hamas, forcibly retrieve the hostages, and it'll be an Israeli victory. The end, everybody lives happily ever after. That is not in the cards right now. It's clear that a year in, that Israel has killed far more hostages than it has rescued, not even close, and in the process has destroyed the entire Gaza Strip. Frankly, people talk about this as if it's collateral damage. From my perspective, I'm almost certain that this is an intentional process, that in the face of not being able to achieve any kind of victory over Hamas, knowing they're deeply dug in, that the alternative they're pursuing right now is one of mass annihilation in Gaza, making Gaza unlivable as a means of eventually getting at Hamas way down the road. And that's not a morally acceptable position. That's not an internationally acceptable position, that we watch an entire population get devastated the way people in Gaza are, children being killed by the tens of thousands. In 90% of the population of Gaza displaced at this point, and still no end to this war. And so there's building regional tension. Other countries that are saying we don't want a full war with Israel. Everybody understands that Israel is a very militarily powerful country that has the backing of the United States, the most powerful country in the world. Nobody wants a full-scale confrontation with Israel. And yet there are parties in the region that are saying we also can't sit quietly and just watch this unfold forever. And so they're pushing back, they're ramping up the pressure very gradually. And Israel got so used to a dynamic of dominance in the region that the idea that there are now other parties in the region that are willing to poke at Israel militarily is something that Israel finds unacceptable. And they're determined, not through behaving reasonably, not through negotiations and a reasonable agreement with neighboring countries and a ceasefire in Gaza, but through brute military force to restore a dynamic in which Israel is in charge in the region and everybody knows their place and stays quiet and backs off when Israel gets angry. And the balance of power has shifted to a point to where that's also not viable, and therefore the confrontation at this point is inevitable.
How has the balance of power shifted?
Groups that are allied with Iran, primarily Hezbollah and Lebanon, have accumulated a certain level of military strength that they're no longer intimidated by Israel. There is mutual assured destruction between Hezbollah and Israel. It's a balance of deterrence in which a full-out war means Israel can destroy all of Lebanon, and probably would, but Hezbollah has the capacity to do the same with Israeli cities as well. And so nobody wants that full-scale war to happen. Both sides are extremely tentative about the prospect of going there because the mass destruction would just be absolutely devastating to both countries. And yet, the reasonable alternative is a ceasefire in Gaza, which Hezbollah has said that would end everything that we're doing up on the northern border, or the alternative is seeing that confrontation through. And what we've been witnessing for months now is that gradual buildup of that confrontation getting more and more intense every day. And we can imagine what the logical conclusion of that is.
Well, I think the logical conclusion is the very thing that seems uncertain based on what you just said. So you maybe gave me hope. This could be possibly delusion, but you said that if I understood you correctly, that Hezbollah actually could be the fire break needed. If the goal is to stop Israel, then you need somebody of equal power that can check them. Now, eventually I'm going to want to get into Iran's role in all of this, because obviously as an entrepreneur, this is how I always speak to my team. A leader's job is to take a lot of dots and connect them. And that connection is the narrative. And you need to intoxicate people with certainty in order to give them direction so they know how to act. I think that as pundits, that's also people's job. So you in particular, anyone else I've had on the show that's talked about this, their job is to articulate for people, hopefully, what they consider the most honest and forthright picture. I don't think people are lying, but their job is to say all of these disparate dots that you, the person who's sort of just now getting introduced to this, you probably don't know how they connect. Let me connect them for you. But this conflict, more than any other conflict, people will connect the same dots, but they tell wildly different narratives. Okay, so peeling back those layers is going to be difficult. But for now, what I want to do is understand your narrative. I have no interest in challenging it until I understand it. And maybe then I'll just be like, yes, word. But what I just heard is Hezbollah may be the fire break that we need, that Israel is going to finally hit a point where they don't want to go to conflict with them because they could destroy Israeli cities as well. Okay.
Yep.
Now, if that's true, but you still worry that this is going to escalate, what is it that's going on from the Israeli frame of reference that would make challenging Hezbollah make enough sense to suffer the damage that would inevitably rain upon Israeli cities?
Yeah. It's, I think, from my perspective, a pathology that has existed in Israel for a very, very long time. The idea that the only way to survive and thrive as a Jewish state in the Middle East is to do it by the sword, is to do it, by threatening everybody around you at the end of a barrel of a gun. And that is how they've done it so far. And it has largely worked out for them, except obviously there is never any kind of perpetual peace or stability as a result of that, because there is a fundamental injustice that is also ongoing with all of that, which is the fact that from Israel's founding, Israel was founded at the expense of another people, right? When people talk about the concept of a Jewish state or Zionism, in the abstract, that's a perfectly fine sentiment to say, especially, obviously, we know the context after World War II, to say that you want a Jewish state. There's no opposition to that in principle. The problem comes when you decide you want a Jewish state at the expense of another people that already exists on a land, and to make displacing them and taking over that land part of that project, then you have a problem. And so from Israel's creation, it was at the expense of literally hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages that were just completely obliterated and destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were driven out of their lands. And then you had a state of Israel. And then later on, there was additional regional tension. Israel expands itself to the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, takes over those areas by force as well. But something different happens here, in that the international community says, wait a second, this takeover of those areas, that's not legitimate. You can't just annex those areas and claim that those are part of Israel. That's occupied territory that Israel is obligated to withdraw from. And that pushed us to the possibility of a peace process at some point in the late 80s and early 90s, in which Palestinians came to understand that they are the weaker party and that they're forced to come to some sort of compromise. And they engaged in the so-called two-state solution negotiations, with the idea that Israel would remain as it was established in 1948 on nearly 80% of the land, and Palestinians would only get a state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And Israel did the exact opposite of what it was supposed to. It said that it was committed to a two-state solution, but it was obviously insincere, because on the ground, all Israel did is expand more and more illegal settlements on top of Palestinians. And in the process, Palestinians who lived there lived under Israeli military dictatorship. They had no rights. So you look at the West Bank today, where there are illegal Israeli settlements directly right next to Palestinian villages. The Israeli settlers live under Israeli law. They live in democracy. They have full voting rights. They have full mobility. And the Palestinians who live directly next to them, they have no rights. They don't have enough water for their towns and villages. They don't get to vote for the government that controls their lives. They are effectively subjects. And when you look at the kind of violence and abuses that they endure as a matter of status quo, I'm not even talking about moments in which violence escalates and we've got an outbreak of a war or anything like that, but just the daily existence of Palestinians under occupation is just unspeakable brutality. Palestinian children are systematically processed through the Israeli military system and thrown in detention where they are routinely tortured, beaten up. That's daily life for Palestinians. And that's a situation of injustice that is ripe for conflict. Because people talk about no justice, no peace sometimes as if it's just a slogan, at a protest, when to me, it's a much more fundamental description of human nature. That in any situation in which you don't have justice, in which somebody is being treated badly, and people don't have their basic rights, you are setting up the situation in order for there not to be peace, in order for conflict to ensue. And that's exactly been the path that we're on. And we've ensured, and when I say we, I'm talking about the United States government with American money, ensured lack of accountability for Israel throughout that entire thing. So we were speaking out of both sides of our mouths. We were saying we support a two-state solution, we support ending the occupation, we support a life of dignity for Palestinians. But the policy is Israel is denying all these things to Palestinians, and our policy is to shield Israel from accountability at the United Nations and to give Israel more and more weapons to continue behaving however it's behaving. And that is why we're in the situation that we're in today. And that's why you start seeing these parts of the region that are bubbling up, looking for a means of resistance to an existing status quo that is just utterly unacceptable and set up for conflict. So back to your original question, which is then why is Israel finds itself now on potentially the path of confrontation? It's because we've nurtured an unhealthy lack of accountability in Israel, that the thought that somebody else might push back on them and that they might be forced to behave in the region as an equal rather than a dominant force that can do whatever it wants and takes whatever it wants is out of their normal frame of reference. And I'm concerned that when you look at Israeli attitudes among military experts, there is a concern of we should not expand this war, we should be careful. Hezbollah, this would not be a cakewalk. We would suffer significant damage. But the political atmosphere and the political culture in Israel is one that is really pushing towards further confrontation, operating under the false belief that all Israel has to do is just go in and be unleashed, and then they'll put everybody in their place. And what I'm hoping for is that the United States, as a country that has leverage over Israel, can behave, when we talk friends don't let friends drive drunk, is to understand that they're on a dangerous path and for the US to intervene and put an end to this before we have to find out through mass death throughout the region through a regional war.
Okay, so obviously a lot there. Let's start teasing some of this out. So you said that there's a pathology in the, I think you didn't use these words, but this is how I read it, in the Israeli mindset.
Political culture, I would say.
Okay, political culture, that violence is the only way to get by. And one question I would ask you is, do you think, given the setup of everything that the Jews have been through over the last 2,000 years, especially given that the founding of Israel comes right after World War II, where for real, even America's like, nope, we're not taking any more in. They've just been killed in the millions. And now they're like, okay, for real, we need to go somewhere. We need to have a place that we can defend. Do you have, so my base assumption is that history is a long string of wars, that peace is the anomaly, not war. So when I see Israel, if you are right, and this doesn't seem crazy to me, that Israel is saying we have to be strong. We've been weak for too long. We're now going to be strong, draw a line in the sand. Anybody messes with us and we're going to push back. Yeah, like that makes sense to me in terms of all of human history.
Yeah.
Okay. So do we, if that really is true, peace is the anomaly. While without, I certainly don't expect you to think that what they're doing is okay or right, because you're coming at it where I think, wouldn't we all want peace to be the norm and violence the anomaly, and we have a chance to do it in this modern era. But given all of that, can you understand, at least from their frame of reference, why they would want to project power?
I hope this is not reaching too far out of the frame, but let me answer it this way. So many things are part of human nature. The propensity for violence, greed, we understand that these things are natural. And yet, when we face the prospect of climate change, we say we have to intervene and put an end to greed and selfishness and work together towards a bigger common good. That we are somehow working against human nature in some ways. So by the same token, I would say that everything you described is accurate. This is true that humans have a propensity for violence and that war is a constant. And the fact that after the experience of World War II and the Holocaust, that there would be people who would think self-preservation at all costs, no matter who pays the cost and how. The question for me is for us as outsiders who we see unhealthy dynamics develop. What is our role? Are we contributing towards negative pathologies that are leading towards more death and conflict? Or having not been in that position directly ourselves and not having our judgment clouded by these kinds of attitudes that are trauma-based, what is our role in this case? And so for me, I always come back to the fact that the United States has an opportunity here. You are the most powerful country in the world. You understand that there are all kinds of traumas and dynamics and pathologies that are at work, but we have the chance to say international law matters. Israel has to behave within the bounds of international law, and that's a way that you can lead to a better future, not just for Palestinians, but for Israelis too. When you look at the natural outcome of the way Israel has been conducting itself, it has also resulted in thousands of dead Israelis along the way. So to even operate with the interests, even if you don't care about Palestinians, and you're more interested in just making sure that Israelis are safe and have a future, it seems that the road towards de-escalation and a reasonable peace agreement and human rights being recognized all across the board is actually good for everyone. So why not take advantage of the fact that we are not living through that trauma directly ourselves, and we can have influence policy in a much, much better direction. And the contrast of that is not also just aspirational. For me, it also comes down to moral responsibility, is that there is a responsibility that Americans should spend their tax money, the money that we make, in a way that the population agrees with, that we support. From my perspective, it should be primarily focused on helping Americans in America. We have all kinds of problems here that are not dealt with. We constantly say that we don't have money for universal health care. We don't have enough money for proper education or free college or a school lunch or you name it. And yet we somehow have money to send billions of dollars to an apartheid regime that is imposing an illegal occupation. And at this point in Gaza, arguably, I would consider it to be reasonable to say, engaged in genocidal violence in Gaza. Is that the best use of our money? Obviously not. That's not what the American people want. And there has to be a change because of that.
If you want to reach your full potential this year, you have got to focus on providing yourself with the best possible building blocks for your brain and body. And that is why I recommend ButcherBox. You guys know ButcherBox is a huge part of my life because they go above and beyond to source only high quality and humanely raised meats and seafood. This includes 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, humanely raised pork, and wild-caught seafood, all shipped for free and delivered directly to your door. This year, get exactly what you need to hit your healthy eating goals.
Here is a special offer for our Impact Theory audience. Go to butcherbox.com/impact and use code IMPACT at checkout to earn a free protein in every box for a year, plus an exclusive discount off your first box. That's butcherbox.com/impact and use code IMPACT. Okay. When talking about this, it can be almost impossible to not layer on layer on layer. And I certainly understand the complexities of this issue. I take a slightly different approach, which is there has to be a way to simplify this to a path forward.
Yeah.
So everything we're going to do in our time together, hopefully, is leading towards building up based on what we know to be true about both sides, what we know to be true about the architecture of the human mind, what we know to be true about power battles on a global stage, all of that, that this theoretical thing that we will talk about at some point today, at least sort of has a chance and is worth being discussed. Okay, so I say all of that because I am going to try to tease these issues out one at a time, just to, again, make sure that I understand the base assumptions that are driving your thinking. So what I hear is that there is massive precedent for any society to believe that one must project power, because war is a constant. However, we are living in a unique moment where, especially because of America's role globally as sort of a hegemonic power, I think we're losing that a little bit, but let's say we're in the tail end and we could still make use of it, that we could speak to what is morally right and not just this old way of thinking around power and projecting power. And so the way that Israel, with what you called a cultural pathology, is acting right now, it is this throwback to a time where only projecting power matters. So they're clamping down on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip because of an internal thing to the architecture of the human mind. As long as they are keeping them locked down and they don't have freedoms, they are going to fight back. And with that injustice, peace is fundamentally impossible to achieve.
I think that is correct. I would add one thing, is that it's not all fear-based that we have to project power because of the potential alternative. There's frankly a significant segment of Israeli society, particularly on the far right, where there's an arrogance of power. It's not fear-based that if we do this, then that might happen. It's knowing that they have the power and capacity to take over the entire land, and they are proceeding accordingly. The expansion of settlements, for example, in the West Bank, that's not a security measure. Putting Israeli civilians in the middle of Palestinian population centers, that's not a security measure. You are only doing it because you want to expand your territory. And in this case, it's the belief that Israel is already so powerful that there are no consequences to behaving however they want to. And therefore, having a messianic view that involves Israel capturing the entire territory from the river to the sea means we can carry on this policy of expanding more and more Israeli settlements, confining Palestinians to smaller and smaller areas, and hoping that eventually either they go away or we don't have to deal with them anymore. So I don't want to overplay the idea that in Israeli psychology, this is all born out of a sense of vulnerability, because there is obviously a part of it in which you see the endless taunting of Israeli soldiers. You see it in the videos that they post of themselves in Gaza, the amount of fun and pleasure they are taking in the destruction of Palestinian society is something that I think is really, really horrific. And we barely get a window of that watching kind of mainstream coverage of the issue.
Okay, so I will certainly agree that no country's intentions are ever going to be pure. When you're in America, it gets pretty easy to see that, people came here, kicked ass, and took over. And that is ugly and horrifying, and also gave birth to everything that I have known and loved. And so it is this incredibly weird.
Yeah. Can I interject on just this particular point? Your description is correct, right? But we operate right now under the assumption that that's just a thing of the past. This is the outcome of it now. But if it were to happen again today, surely we would not do the same thing. Surely we recognize that the genocide of Native Americans was wrong, that slavery was wrong, that Jim Crow was wrong. We operate under this idea that we've made cultural evolution here. And yet we're in a moment in which we're watching another country do that. And instead of saying, hey, this is our moment to rectify our sins of the past, we're saying more power to you. Go ahead and do it in the present, not as a historical event that you can reflect on and say, was it for good or bad, but a process that is currently unfolding where Palestinian society is being destroyed before our eyes. And our response to it is not just to sit on the sidelines, but to actually arm and fund that process.
Okay, but that assumes everybody shares your frame of reference. So your frame of reference is certainly internally consistent. I think it will be very difficult for me or anybody else to be like, like you're contradicting yourself here. You certainly have taken dots, you've connected them in a way that make a lot of sense. I'm able to track it, I can repeat it back to you. So that says there's a well thought out, internally consistent thing. Now, this is where me as the entrepreneur, I just can't help myself. I start going, okay, but what's our desired outcome? Mm-hmm. And how are we going to get there? So what we haven't looked at, so I think you've done a very good job of giving a frame of reference for how to look at the Israelis that is replete with all of the grotesque elements of the human psyche that I do not think is unique to Israelis. I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it best when he said the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. I think people have beautiful intent, and then 3 seconds later, horrific intent. And also, which is which will determine who you're talking to and what frame of reference they have. Because obviously, if you're the parent of somebody who was kidnapped on October 7th, like, yeah, you're here for some violence. You're here to blow people's heads off, 1,000%. And I think we are hardwired to feel that way, to want to protect our own over everything else. I get it. So anyway, all of that is going to matter a lot. But now I think that we have to ask the question. So if the Israeli impulse is not pure, so some of it is like, and let's even say that in the beginning, it was mostly like, hey, we really need a place to protect ourselves, but then sort of quickly got weird. I'm totally fine with that. But do you think there is any weirdness on the Hamas side? Does Hamas have pure intentions, or are they equally a mix of, I want to do good, but also I'm living in Qatar, I'm a billionaire, while a lot of my people are just in abject poverty.
Yeah. With Hamas in particular, it's worth asking how they came about. And I think that that can give us a lot of answers. We can kind of like track the evolution of them. They came about as a result of the occupation. Israel took over the Palestinian territories, denied people rights there. And that frustration naturally builds into militant resistance. Now, the Hamas particular flavor happens to be a religious one. It happens to be Islamic resistance to occupation and this need to a religiously motivated need to say that only violence is how we liberate ourselves. A lot of rhetoric about what was taken away by violence can only be retrieved by violence and so on. And for me, it becomes a question. It's not about whether individual people within Hamas are well motivated or not. It's about the fact that why did this become a draw for people? When did they gain support? And to me, the relevant part, from a practical perspective, when we're talking about where we're going moving forward, is to say that when Palestinians believed in the prospect of a Palestinian state that is free from Israeli occupation, that Israel was seriously interested in ending the occupation at the beginning of the peace process, Hamas, they had virtually no support among Palestinians. They were trying to derail the peace talks by setting off bombs, carrying out suicide bombings in the 90s and so on. And there was Palestinian opposition to them. It is only when it became absolutely clear that Israel is not actually genuinely interested in ending the occupation, and that what they were doing is playing this game, that the entire so-called peace process was a sham, and Israel kept expanding more and more settlements and entrenching the occupation and making clear that there is no future in which Palestinians are free in their land, is when Hamas, their popularity grew significantly. And so looking at Hamas fighters now in Gaza, I'm sure it ranges from people who are genuinely interested in fighting as a means of resistance because they want to be free, and maybe people whose motivations are even far beyond that. Maybe individuals who, whatever they might be motivated by, whatever religious ideas that they have on top of that, and are capable of carrying out far worse atrocities. And there's no question that Hamas has engaged in many, many atrocities as well. Any attack on civilians is by definition a war crime, and Hamas has engaged in attacks on civilians, which, just completely indefensible. So to me, there's no contradiction there. We're looking at pathologies once again playing out and understanding that the reason why people who pursue violence in Palestinian society have all the support is because with US impunity, we've made sure that Israel has blocked every path for peaceful resistance. And that's what drove them into that corner, rather than trying to analyze the individual psychology of any particular member in Hamas or the leadership or whatever. It's the fact that Palestinians have done negotiations that have fallen apart. They've done economic boycotts. The US has put enormous pressure to cut off the boycotts. They've gone to the UN. The US intervenes and makes sure resolutions don't pass. And Palestinians in Gaza did the March for Return back in 2018, in which they marched unarmed to the fence separating Israel from Gaza, saying we don't want to be locked in this cage. And by the way, that I think is a really, really important piece of context, is that before October 7th, Gaza has been an open-air prison. It's been a cage for Palestinians. They have no airport. They have no seaport. Palestinians can't go in and out. They can't trade with the outside world. Their economy is in shambles. Unemployment is at 50%. They were not living like human beings. There was no prospect for a Palestinian parent in Gaza to think, I want a better future for my child, and to work towards a better future for their child, because they were prisoners in this cage that Israel imposed on them, that the entire world agreed was unlawful. The UN, every major human rights organization said this siege is unlawful. And Israel would periodically carry out bombings in Gaza that have killed, again, before October 7th, hundreds of Palestinian children throughout these bombings. And so that's the condition in which Palestinians existed in. They decided that unarmed resistance is something that's worth giving a shot to. And so they marched to the fence separating Israel from Gaza, and Israeli snipers opened fire into the crowd. And if you read human rights organizations' reports on it, it talks about targeting of children, of journalists, of medics. It's just, again, a sense of complete and total impunity that these soldiers can effectively have fun with this horde that is working towards them, opening fire, completely dehumanizing them. And when you think of that being the last straw of every means of resistance Palestinians tried, there is absolutely no surprise at the fact that Hamas is able to recruit tens of thousands of fighters in Gaza. That is the natural outcome of a situation that is fundamentally unjust and drives people to extreme behavior.
Okay, this will be a good point for me to plant a flag that says I am aware of the counter arguments on the other side. I am, given that I am actually trying to make sense of what I think is a useful path forward. A, I have no desire to be in a debate. B, I'm not a good debater, so let's start with that. And then C, what I'm trying to do right now is really map out the base assumptions that you have. But I don't want people to think, because the comments are going to be alight with, no, they were sending over incendiary balloons and all that, and Tom's just a moron, and he doesn't know. So I am aware of those things, but I think it's very useful to understand your frame of reference, that you see those as a last-ditch effort to test a peaceful approach to this. Because one of the big things that I wrote down even before we met that I see as your base assumption is that if you communicate to a people that they will never be free, they are going to mount an armed resistance because they have nothing left to lose. And so again, not trying to judge that, just trying to say, okay, cool, I get where you're coming from. I understand where you're coming from. I am able to piece together your internal worldview and again, say it back to you. Okay, so dear commenters, if you've made it this far, that's not the place to put the pressure. So what we wanna do, I think, for us to have a path forward, we must understand the rough frames of reference on each side, understand why they are colliding, and in that reality, knowing what's actually happening, how do we carve a path forward? Okay, so Israel has no right to put up a blockade. I'm reiterating what I've heard you say. Israel has no right to put up a blockade. Every peaceful thing that the Palestinians have attempted has been met with violence or just apathy, so they realize that's not going to work. The Israelis have a mixed bag of motivations, some fear and some just arrogance of power. And when you put the Palestinian people in a situation where they can't make life better for themselves, suddenly the only way to look at your life is I'm in an open air prison. And so sure, it's better than being in a closed air prison, but this is still a dead end and I no longer have hope for my children. Okay, that touches on one of my base assumptions, which is for any nation, literally any nation, to move forward in what I would consider a positive way, which I won't waste time defining that right now, but for any nation to move forward in a positive way, they need a optimistic view of both the present and the future. They need a vision, an honorable vision. Again, I have a definition for that, but I won't drag us down in that right now. But they need an honorable vision for how to spend their lives and how to make sure that their children's lives are better. And so this is an area where if your frame of reference is the right frame of reference from which to look at this, or even if I just adopt it, right or wrong, I'm like, yeah, I get it. I get why, if you really believe you're the Palestinian on the ground, you did the march, you were super peaceful, and you watched your sister get her face blown off, it's like all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, I don't have any options left. Now, again, I'm not saying that that frame of reference is right. I'm just saying if you have that frame of reference, then suddenly you can predict the outcomes that we're seeing now. So again, internal consistency. Now, I want to start figuring out, though, what are the motivations of Hamas? Like, what pointedly would Hamas be cool? Would they agree to any go forward status that involved Israel as is today?
I think that Hamas, sort of their strategy has not been completely consistent and coherent. There are different times in which they've suggested different things. And I think that part of it, the international community could have helped shape the direction in which Hamas was going to move in. So when they started out, they were completely rejectionist. There should not be an Israel and armed resistance all the way. And it's kind of like very theologically driven, messianic idea of how you achieve liberation. And over time, that actually has shifted. And when they won elections back in 2005, 2006, after Israel withdrew from Gaza, they put out very clear suggestions that they're willing to moderate. Their leader, Khaled Mash'al, published a piece in the Washington Post talking about how even though we don't like a two-state solution, if we put it to a referendum and Palestinians accept it, we're not going to be the ones to obstruct it. They showed signs of moderation and flexibility. And in the face of that, I think if there was encouragement of that, you could have moved Hamas in a more pragmatic direction.
And why wasn't there encouragement?
Israel responded immediately by putting all of Gaza under a tighter lockdown and said that Hamas has three things they have to do if they want to have to change the status quo. They have to recognize Israel, they have to renounce violence, and they have to accept all previous agreements that the Palestinian Authority had signed with Israel. Now, what's interesting about that is that Israel does not recognize Palestine. So Israel was making a demand of Hamas that Israel itself did not reciprocate.
Had they reciprocated, would this have gone through?
I mean, that's really the entire problem with the two-state solution and peace process is that everything was given from one side and the other side responded by just rejecting everything, by saying, let's talk. That was the game that was played. Is, hey, let's talk. We're still negotiating. Let's figure out the details.
So you think Israel was being insincere?
Completely insincere.
Just trying to keep the talks going.
Absolutely. They used that as cover, and that became much clearer later on.
Now, is this because, so I'm formulating again, I said this off camera, so I'll say it on camera. Whenever I'm talking to somebody, I ask myself, if I were writing this person as a character, what would they need to believe for them to say this or act in this way? It would make immediate sense to me if you believe, boys and girls, all Israel wants, I don't care what they say, what they want is to ethnically cleanse, which is a fancy way of saying they want to make all the Palestinians leave. And they want the whole area for themselves. They want East Jerusalem. They want the whole Gaza Strip. Like they just want it all. And so no matter what they do, say, whatever, it is all it's a smokescreen for what they're really doing, which is provoke to get you to attack. And then they have justification to literally just level Gaza so that you leave because you have no reason to be there anymore because there's nothing left. And then they're going to take it over. And that's been the real desire for God knows how long.
And the status quo when these large violent outbursts don't happen is not just, the provocation is that exact same process, just in slow motion. What changes is the scale and speed of it. Throughout the so-called peace process, again, times that are peaceful in which there isn't an outbreak of Palestinian violence. The part where Israel is pushing Palestinians out of their homes in the occupied territories and building settlements and replacing one population with another, that's an ongoing process. That's the status quo. And, you mentioned a second ago when we were talking about sort of anticipating what the counter arguments are for how peaceful Palestinians are. I think people can easily posit a counter argument that is basically a smattering of acts of violence by Palestinians. Well, there was this suicide bombing and there was this rocket attack and there was this incendiary balloon. The point for me is that what is the status quo when those things are not happening? We're not operating under two equal sides that are both free, they have a border separating them, and then one side launches a rocket or an incendiary balloon. The status quo is one in which one population rules another, in which you have an occupier and an occupied. One people that is in charge of everything and all the borders and all the water and all the land, and another people who have to endure whatever is imposed on them. So even though you can you can point to random instances of Palestinian violence, and they're certainly real, and they're obviously not all justified because of that distinction between civilian targets and military targets, that doesn't change the fact that the fundamental reality, the status quo, is one itself of injustice. So we play this game of what came first. And every time you get into an argument about what happened, well, they did this because of that. Well, they did this because of that. And you can have that timeline go back forever. And I'm not interested in tracing that timeline back forever. If you want to trace it back forever, it still starts with the fact that Israel displaced Palestinians to create Israel. That to me is the starting point. But I don't think we have to play that game of tracing it all the way back. We have a status quo and an existing reality in which one people is free and another people is not. And so whenever people talk about what's the cause of violence, obviously, the starting point, when you talk about who started it, the people who's denying freedom to another people is by definition the aggressor because that's the dynamic between them.
Okay, so could you ever see a world where Palestinians would come to the table and say, we think you're lying. We think you just want to take over everything. But here in front of the global community, we would like to say, we renounce violence for the next 10 years. And at the end of that 10 years, assuming that there are no meaningful attacks, because we can't, there's always going to be some asshole that does something stupid, but that there are no meaningful attacks, that all blockades are lifted, two-state solution immediately, let's go. Would that feel good? Would you be like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is a step in the right direction?
Yeah, that you're not describing a fictional period. You're describing a real one which is the peace process. That is what the
that's
1990s
what prompted
was.
it.
Yes.
So I'm aware
Yeah.
of that was one of the things where they said you have to do
Yeah.
that for 10 years. But what I'm trying to figure out is if your response to that is, are you out of your mind? You have no right to lock these people up, not for 10 days, not for 10 years. That's absurd.
No.
Or if you're going to be like, oh my God, I would love that so much. That would be incredible. We've suffered for so long, 10 years, we can get by. Like this would be.
Yeah, and it's beyond what I feel, right? Like for me, at the end of the day, I'm not the one suffering the consequences for it, like directly. It's the people on the ground. And they accepted that framework. They said the occupation is going to gradually end in the peace process, that Israel is going to be gradually pulling back. And Palestinians, you have to just show good faith. You recognize Israel. Now you have to build your institutions and crack down on violence. And the Palestinian Authority largely did what Israel wanted of them. There was, as you mentioned, some asshole on occasion who would set off a bomb here or do an attack there. But by and large, the Palestinian Authority was praised by Israeli leaders at the time for cracking down on violence and for kind of like going after. And that was extremely unpopular, by the way, with a lot of Palestinians too, who felt, how dare you go after the people resisting occupation? And from the Palestinian Authority's perspective is, listen, this is the price we have to pay in the meantime in order to demonstrate that we are ready to have a state, and then maybe we can convince Israel to allow us to have a state. That was the framework, and it failed because Israel was not genuinely interested in it. So
get specific. When did it fail? What happened?
In 1993 was the launch. In 1988, Palestinians recognized Israel. And then there was the talks leading up to the official peace process. 1993, the Oslo peace process began. That was based on the idea that Israel was going to end the occupation and Palestinians get to have a state. But within that, there were some details that Palestinians just assumed good faith on the part of Israel. They said, we're not going to take over all the West Bank, but there's going to be some natural growth of settlements. And the Palestinians said, yeah, that's fine. Like if some settlement expands a little bit here or there. But then what happened in the subsequent 7 years is the number of settlers doubled, like the expansion of those settlements. It was not natural by any stretch of the imagination. It was Israel transferring its population into the occupied territories in violation of international law and making clear that there's no Palestinian state that's going to be allowed to exist viably at the end of that. The Israeli argument is, no, we said fine, we're going to give you a Palestinian state. But when you look at the maps of what was offered, it's basically Swiss cheese. It's areas, Bandustans, like what was basically what black self-rule was in apartheid South Africa. It's these tiny isolated areas. And Israel's like, you can call that a state. Here you have a state, but obviously it was not viable. Had no control of its borders. Israel controlled everything, including the water resources and so on. It just simply was not viable, to the point that Israel's foreign minister at the time, when the things fell apart in the year 2000 and you've had a Palestinian uprising, the trigger of that Palestinian uprising was Ariel Sharon, a war criminal by any definition. He was Israel's defense minister at the time, walking over into the Muslim part of Temple Mount, what's called the Noble Sanctuary, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is and everything, surrounded by 1,000 soldiers as a show of saying, we're never going to relinquish Israeli control of this area. And that triggered Palestinians to throw rocks and shoes at them. Israeli soldiers opened fire, killed 7 unarmed people, and that just basically sparked the Palestinian uprising, the Second Intifada. It's not the incident. The incident is just the straw that broke the camel's back. The buildup of that was 7 years in which Palestinians kept being told, independence is coming, your state is coming, your freedom is coming, and it simply never came. And that led to that explosion.
Okay, do you think that the average Israeli has this, what I'll call cynical view that you're saying that Israel, the country, the government, puts forward, which is we're going to get it all no matter what, and everything else is a sham? Do you think the average Israeli also believes that?
So it's interesting with Israeli public opinion is that at the time when this was happening, there was a significant peace camp in Israel that was genuinely interested in reconciliation and figuring things out, where, heavily leaning towards the prospect of a two-state with Palestinians. What I think Israel effectively did is lay the blame on Palestinians for the failure of those talks. So I don't think that the discourse that was intended primarily, I think, for an external audience as a way to relieve Israel from pressure played well. It was basically propaganda that worked effectively within the Israeli population as well, which is the idea that we offered Palestinians a state and they said, no, clearly they just want to destroy us. That's why there is no peace. I think that narrative took hold within a good portion of Israeli society, and that contributed to the belief that just peace with these people is not possible. Oppress them or push them out or whatever, it doesn't really matter. That kind of became the dominant attitude. And unlike the US, where younger Americans are far more progressive and diverse and tolerant and interested in, the well-being of other people and so on. The trend in Israel is the opposite, that younger people are far more anti-Palestinian than the older generation. And so things are trending in a very, very dark direction. You can watch endless footage of Israeli youth marching by the hundreds, chanting death to the Arabs. Not just one or two isolated instances, but it's the norm. There's something called Jerusalem Day, in which Israelis celebrate their capture of East Jerusalem. Again, illegal under international law. But every Jerusalem Day, hundreds of Israelis, if not thousands, march through the Palestinian part of Jerusalem, just wreaking havoc, beating up random Palestinians, destroying shops. It's just what happens year after year to chants of death to the Arabs. And that is just so normalized within Israeli society at this point. And again, it's just frustrating that you don't see a glimpse of that looking at this as an American spectator, is that Hamas's extremism is visible to everyone. You don't have, every lay American has a pretty good idea when you ask them, do you have a positive or a negative impression of, October 7th or whatever? Obviously, everybody knows that was a terrible attack because it included a significant portion of that is an attack on civilians, and that Hamas is comfortable with attacks on civilians, and that should be disqualifying morally. But they don't know the same either about the level of anti-Palestinian racism that permeates Israeli society, or the scale of deliberate atrocities that the Israeli military targets Palestinian civilians with. That you've had people on the show before who kind of like draw that contrast of, sure, Israel is killing more civilians, but there's a moral difference because it's by accident. When Hamas kills them, it's on purpose, but when Israel kills them, it's by accident. But that's just simply not true. When you look at the reports of human rights organizations, they all say that there is mass indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas. They don't talk about Israel trying to pinpoint the terrorists and missing. When you talk about human shields, I bet if I simply say who uses human shields in Palestine and Israel, almost 10 out of 10 are going to say Hamas uses human shields. Not a single person is going to say the Israeli military does. The reality is the opposite, and it's mind-boggling and deeply frustrating that nobody knows that basic fact, which is that it is official Israeli military policy to use Palestinian civilians as human shields. It was at the beginning of the Second Intifada for many years, hundreds of cases of that happening, one case in which somebody was killed. And then in 2005, the Israeli Supreme Court steps in and says, okay, we've gone too far. We need to put an end to this practice. From now on, human shields, you can't use Palestinian civilians as human shields. And the Israeli military objects. The Israeli defense minister at the time goes to court to argue the opposite case, saying using Palestinian civilians as human shields saves the lives of our soldiers, and it should be allowed. The Israeli Supreme Court holds its ground and insists that that cannot continue. And yet in practice, even though it has become illegal to use Palestinian civilians as human shields in the Israeli military, the practice is dime a dozen. There is not a single instance of conflict between Palestinians and Israelis in which there aren't documented cases of that happening. Back in 2008, 2009 in Gaza, a 10-year-old Palestinian boy was caught being used as a human shield. Human Rights Watch described the punishment that the soldiers got as, quote, a slap on the wrist. They got demoted for being caught using a young Palestinian boy as a human shield. And when you look at what Hamas practices, just as a matter of technicality, I'm not denying that they hide among civilians. That's effectively what they do. There is an imbalance of power here in which you don't have aircrafts and tanks and bombers and all the advanced technology that Israel has. So Hamas cannot go and confront the Israeli military on a battlefield like any guerrilla group. What they do is hide. In the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon, they hide in massive fields and banana trees. In the case of Gaza, there is nowhere else to hide except the civilian infrastructure because it's 2 million people crammed into a very tiny and very urban place. And so where Hamas hides is in civilian areas. So even though there's some legitimacy to the idea that you have to fight in urban areas if you're going after Hamas, the practice is not the literal use of human shields, the way it is the literal use of human shields in the case of the Israeli military. And these are the kinds of facts that I think most Americans simply don't know.
Okay, so now you're on to the really contentious one here. We haven't talked about genocide yet, which that's probably good. Human shields. So let me ask, do you think that Hamas wants to maximize the loss of civilian life as a way to gain public opinion in the West, to put pressure on the US, to put pressure on other governments, to pressure Israelis?
Let me answer this question. And again, my answer may seem naive at first, but let me explain. I don't think that's true. I think Hamas did what they did on October 7th, knowing full well that Israel is going to go berserk in Gaza. They knew that there was going to be a very significant civilian death toll as a result of Israel's, because that's the only way Israel behaves, is that after every provocation or whatever, they feel they have to respond with overwhelming force. That's their military doctrine. Explicitly, the Israeli military doctrine is to induce mass suffering among civilians as a means of putting pressure on the political leadership and make them less daring to commit these kinds of acts in the future. That is the doctrine. But I don't think that they literally want Palestinian civilians to die. That's a little bit different. And for me, the piece of evidence that's obvious is in the fact that Israel uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. And just think of the logical outcome of that. If the Israeli military operating in the West Bank when there were still Hamas militants and many other Palestinian militants used to think that it saves the lives of their soldiers to put a Palestinian in front of them, it must be because they know that the other side is going to be reluctant to shoot at them because there are Palestinian civilians present. And the logical conclusion of that is that they don't believe that Palestinian militants want to kill their own people, because if they did, there would just simply not be any use for that practice. And I think it's similar to what is unfolding in Gaza right now. When you look at the scale of the destruction, nobody can credibly say that they're making a pinpointed effort to go after specific terrorists. When you look at the statements of Israeli leaders leading up to this, Netanyahu, there's the famous genocidal quotes about, invoking the Amalek from the Bible, which is a biblical reference to killing every last man, woman, and child of the Amalek. And they talked about treating Palestinians like human animals, about no water, no fuel in Gaza, no food coming in and out, that kind of rhetoric. And then you have the more specific policy that is tied to it, which is Netanyahu talking with Ron Dermer, another Israeli official who was the ambassador at some point, talking about that the strategy is to thin the population in Gaza down to a minimum. That was reported in the Israeli press. And then you look at, there's an Israeli publication called 972 magazine. They've done interviews with high-ranking intelligence officials and military officials in Israel. And the stuff that emerged is just absolutely shocking about the fact that Israel had a deliberate strategy of bombing quote-unquote power targets. And those are things that are similar to the shock and awe campaign that we've had in Iraq. And they report specifically on instances in which Israel toppled high-rises in Gaza, civilian high-rises, residential buildings, without any prior warning. That's not the behavior of somebody who's really interested in distinguishing between military and civilian targets. And when you look at the testimonies of soldiers, when you look at the videos that have emerged of what soldiers are doing, none of them are held accountable. You have repeatedly footage of Israeli snipers opening fire into Palestinian civilians and children. You've had American doctors. This was featured, by the way, on CBS. One of every few weeks, there is one individual report in American media that just feels like a breath of fresh air, reporting on terrible stuff, but the fact that at least people get to see it. CBS did an interview with an American Jewish doctor who went to visit Gaza. And what the doctor described is the fact that there was a systematic targeting of Palestinian children with sniper bullets. And that has been repeated by many other testimonies of international doctors who have been, that they see just an unbelievable number of Palestinian children who arrive with a single sniper bullet lodged in their brain. And they've concluded that there is obviously a targeting of Palestinian children. And you see it sometimes caught on tape. There was a young Palestinian child holding the hand of his mother and of his grandmother, and the grandmother is waving a white flag, and they're walking perfectly, obviously not posing any threat. An Israeli sniper takes out the grandmother, the child goes running off. No accountability for that kind of instance. And it's not only happening in Gaza, even in the West Bank. At the beginning of this mess, I think he's back in either October or November, there was 2 separate instances of Israeli soldiers opening fire that were caught on tape, killing young Palestinian children who were clearly posing absolutely no threat to anyone.
Okay,
just playing in the street.
This part of your argument I already understand. Mm-hmm. So just to recap, so you know that I understand, Israel has cultural pathology. No matter what they're saying publicly, the reality is that they are going to get the whole of that land for themselves. They are perfectly happy to ethnically cleanse and destroy Palestine, literally raze it to the ground so that they can take it over and build it back and have it for themselves. the line through good and evil certainly runs through their heart. So they're perfectly happy to take people out just because they don't like Palestinians and they want them gone. So the individual instances, that's where I find people really get bogged down. I just want to understand the worldview so that we can then say, okay, let's take this worldview as fact for the sake of argument. What would a path be forward if your worldview is fact? So hopefully you feel heard and understood.
I do. And I sometimes indulge with detail just because I think to paint a picture, because there's always a lot of people who will say, well, it seems implausible that nobody does this. Like it can't be on purpose.
Drives me crazy about that strategy. So when you and Destiny debated, for instance, there's tit for tat. Like there is a read of each situation that when you read the human shield thing, you make Israelis sound terrible. And when he reads the human shield thing, he makes Hamas sound terrible. So there's no question, like there are very cogent, internally consistent arguments to be made from each side that you can step inside of each frame of reference and look at the behavior and go, yeah, with that frame of reference, this behavior has internal consistency.
Here's my pushback though, is that yes, many people can have individual opinions on it, but mine are consistent with what major human rights organizations have to say, including Israeli human rights organizations. And I think that ought to add credibility to something.
Yeah, I think it's very important for people to understand about the way that you approach this is very much from a moral place. In fact, one of my questions, which I'll just ask now, is this a land dispute or is this a moral question?
I don't think that those are mutually exclusive in this case. It is obviously the core of the problem is that one people is being pushed off of their land and being taken over by another. And I think that has significant moral implications about what is the correct way to resolve the situation. And you have, right, because we talk about this sometimes in two parts. There's the argument, people sometimes split it up. The starting point for a lot of people is Israel is justified in launching this war on Gaza, given what happened on October 7th. And then the debate is exclusively within the confines of, are they overdoing it? Have they gone too far? Should they pull back? Are they doing it right? And from my perspective, even if you were to accept that premise, the answer is still no. Even if you're genuinely, what you're doing is trying to defend yourself, the idea that you can slaughter tens of thousands of children from another people in order for you to live in a little bit more security is a obviously morally broken way to look at the world. That the lives of other children ought to matter the same as anybody else's. But my problem with that, the bigger problem is that the starting point is false. Israel is not defending itself in Gaza. Israel is defending its occupation, its system of apartheid and dominance over Palestinians. Because you can resolve this entire conflict and end the security threat that Israel feels by resolving this conflict. You know, Israel settled with Egypt. They fully withdraw from Egyptian territories and left the Sinai. And as a result, eventually you had a peace agreement in which right now there is no risk of violence between Egyptians and Israelis, at least certainly not over anything that beyond how Palestinians are being treated. And to me, the solution here is very, very simple. If you're interested in security, in Israeli security, you can't do it at the expense of Palestinians because that's going to endlessly be a source of insecurity for Israel. You do it by recognizing Palestinian rights. And Israel, having ruled out the idea that we can have Palestinians stay here and live here with full rights, full human beings, with the same dignity and freedom that Israelis enjoy, if you rule that out, only then can Israel pretend that what they're doing right now is defensive, but what they're really defending is a system in which they dominate Palestinians and Palestinians have no freedom. That is what we're witnessing. So it's wrong in principle and also wrong in its conduct. Palestinians deserve to live in Palestine. They deserve to have full rights there the same way Israelis enjoy them. And you can either do it through one state, and we're all familiar with that. You can think of in the United States, what pre-Jim Crow life was like versus post. We just have equality for everyone. And the same thing with South Africa, sort of ending apartheid and everybody gets equal rights. Or if you want to indulge the Israeli fear of the prospect of one state and what it means for Jews to potentially be a minority in the land and all that stuff, the alternative is two states, which Palestinians have already bent over backwards to accommodate as a compromise, in which they only get a fraction of the land back, 22%. And if you don't get to have a tiny state and you don't get to have equality, and what you're proposing is permanent apartheid in that land, that is morally indefensible and requires an intervention.
Okay, so the thing that I bump against in your worldview is if you believe that Israel is lying, immoral, and they're just going to do what they want to do unless they are forced by a greater power, in this case America, to win. I think your pitch would be to withdraw funds, so just let them sort of wither on the vine. That your perspective does not allow for an Israel that can be reasoned with. And so when I step inside of your frame of reference, the only option is military. Because, well, diplomacy first to weaken their relationship with the US, but then military because they are pathological culturally. That is a quote. So now it's like, okay, well, whatever's true is true. And so if that is true, then okay, then that's where we're at. Now, the naive, optimistic person in me does not want to believe that that is true. I don't have a frame of reference. My own frame of reference, which admittedly is far less informed than yours, and so I take my own with a gigantic grain of salt. But when I look at it, I think, ooh, I really hope that isn't true, because if it isn't true, then we only have the escalation of violence remaining to us.
So I disagree with that. I think the South Africa model and apartheid there is the obvious one. There is nothing fundamentally inherently wrong with white people in South Africa that makes them terrible and irredeemable. They're just human. And it's a power dynamic in which they had immense privilege at the expense of another people, and they were happy to indulge it as long as they could. And it took enormous international pressure, primarily economic pressure and global isolation, for them to feel like, okay, we need to move things in a better direction. So we did not need to invade South Africa in order to undo the apartheid system. It is applying political and economic pressure on a system in order to make sure that it accommodates for the rights of other people. And I think very similarly about Israel. I don't think that the only path forward is escalation and violence. I think there's a world in which we apply enough economic and political pressure on Israel to get them to behave in a more moral direction. To me, what's making the violence part inevitable is our unwillingness to do that. Our unwillingness to hold Israel accountable meaningfully and to apply the levers of pressure that we do have is what's pushing us in a direction in which violence is going to be the ultimate outcome of all this in a far bigger and more explosive way. And what I'm hoping for is an intervention that doesn't get us there, to understand that obviously there isn't anything inherently wrong about Israelis as human beings, but they are stuck right now in a political dynamic in which they have immense privilege at the expense of another people. There is no cost for it. And we don't have the luxury to just wait and say, in a few hundred years, like the Americans, we've thought, when we look back, we go, oh yeah, that was terrible, we shouldn't have done that. And then we have some museum and commemoration for people that we've oppressed and wiped off the face of the earth in the past. We don't have to wait that long. We can apply the levers of pressure that we currently have in order to make sure that we don't have to enter that in that way.
Right. Either I've misunderstood something that you said earlier and you didn't correct me when I reiterated it, or this is the first internal inconsistency in your argument. So the problem with that assessment is that right now inside of Israel, there's whatever, 20%, 30% Arabs that live in Israel, have full citizenship, full rights. There's no apartheid.
I wouldn't say full, but yeah, it's they can participate in elections, they can serve in parliament, they can serve as judges. Like, they're definitely immensely better off than Palestinians in the occupied territories, but not quite fully equal. There is less funding for their schools. There is all kinds of housing discrimination.
When you say apartheid, is that the part you're talking about? Or are you talking about Gaza? I always thought you meant Gaza.
The West Bank and Gaza are probably the most extreme version of it, where there's complete denial of the rights of Palestinians. Really, if you want to put it, it's like there's Israeli Jews are the ones who have full privileges, full rights. One step down is Palestinian citizens of Israel. So those are citizens of Israel. Another step down is Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Another step down is the remaining Palestinians in the West Bank. And the people who have it the worst are in Gaza. So it's a complex system of several levels of rights that people have. But fundamentally, what it is at its core, it's that Israeli Jews have full rights and Palestinians of different categories have minus different categories within that. So for Palestinian citizens of Israel, just as a random example, there's in America, when you go to buy a home, if people say, sorry, we don't think you're the right fit for this neighborhood because you're culturally not just quite right, and you say that to a black family in a white neighborhood, that's instantly a lawsuit. in Israel, there's things called housing admittance committees or something like that. I don't remember what the official name of them is. And those say that you have to be culturally suitable to live in a particular town. And it's very thinly coded language about Palestinian citizens of Israel not living in the same neighborhoods that Jews want exclusively for themselves. And the Israeli Supreme Court defended that practice. And you have just, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you can't marry whoever you want and then have them move to Israel and become a citizen, in a way that if you're a Jewish citizen of Israel, anybody who's Jewish anywhere in the world can become a citizen, and you can marry anyone and bring them to Israel to live with you. So there's discrimination within that is still foundationally about maintaining demographic privilege and making sure that the demography is not messed with within Israel, that they want to maintain a overwhelming Jewish majority and through that overwhelming Jewish rights at the expense of Palestinians. But certainly when you talk to Palestinian citizens of Israel, their lives are substantially better, reasonably close to normal compared to what Palestinians in the West Bank have to endure, which is military dictatorship, and worse yet, the people in Gaza who are effectively living in a cage and can't go in and out and have no freedom at all.
Okay, this may be a complicated side mission here. What would you do if you stepped inside the Israeli frame of reference, meaning their frame of reference as reported, not the frame of reference you have of them and step inside of that, but the frame of reference as they report it themselves? How would you negotiate maintaining a Jewish state?
So I'm arguing on behalf of a Jewish state in this?
So for me, this is where we start getting into the real meat and potatoes of why we are stuck here. So in fact, let me draw a parallel real fast. So my wife's family got caught up in the invasion of Cyprus by the Turks.
Yep.
And her stepmom was one of the people that was forcibly evicted from her home. She thought she was going to be gone for a weekend, and she ended up being gone for 40 years.
Yeah.
And surprise, you've now been evicted. And they drew a line on the island, and everybody's gotten along with their business. Now, of course, Greece will occasionally ask, like, hey, we want some help. We want to resolve this. But the reason that's not going to go anywhere is you've now had 40-ish years, I don't remember the exact number, of people living there in those homes. And so while it is absolutely gut-wrenching that my stepmother-in-law, and you can make her cry just by bringing it up. I mean, for her, it's still very fresh, but she's never going back. Like that, now you're just going to revisit that trauma on whoever has grown up there and raised their kids. And, 40 years is a long-ass time.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, for the most part, Cyprus has just got on with life. It was like, yep, we just lost half of our island, and that really sucked. And if they had the military power, I'm sure they would have fought back right then and there, but they didn't. And so they said, cool, we don't want an eternity of bloodshed. And they just rolled with it.
Yeah.
So when I look at this conflict, like there is some sticking point that isn't about injustice from where I'm sitting. This is about something else that I don't know that we've gotten to yet. I don't even know that I understand yet. But when I step inside the Israeli frame of reference as reported, and I don't just assume that secretly they want to take everything, I go, I have a tiger by the tail. And some part of me knows I can't hold on to this tiger forever. It's no way for me to live.
Yeah.
It's no way for the tiger to live. But I've grabbed a tiger by the tail. And even if you just start the story with me grabbing the tiger, they're pissed off now because I've grabbed their tail, and they're not going to be good with that. But if I let go, I get bitten. And so I'm now in a quandary. How do I let go of the tail in a way that is responsible?
Yeah.
Now, we live in a fantasy land here where, hey, we're all human. So we can just say, I would like to let go, but please don't bite me.
Yeah.
Largely because there's 1,000 people here with guns, and if you bite me, they're all going to shoot you. And in that, there's some sticking point that still makes it impossible for both sides to be like, yeah, cool. Like, let go. Here are the things that we're going to be good with. And so the reason I was asking, is this a land dispute or is this a moral quandary? if this is a moral quandary and a question of a cultural belief in justice, people will do crazy things to get justice. And now you're going to have, if both sides see it that way, it's going to be endless tit for tat because we're here for justice. Also, if this is a religious thing, and if this is really about what God wants for each of us, again, going to be intractable. But if, on the other hand, this is people that don't yet see a clear vision for how they make their children's lives better than theirs, but that's what they really want, then it's solvable. But there is, that's so obvious. I know that question has been asked a gazillion times. I don't even need to hear it. I know. So it's obviously dismissed. It never comes up in debates. Nobody ever talks about it. I feel like a lone voice in the wilderness going, hey, why are we not asking the question of how do you get both sides to say what's better for my children? And then let's do that. And then we get lost in the weeds. Now, again, I said this earlier, but I think it bears repeating for people to understand my position. The reason getting lost in the weeds to me is fruitless at a definitional level, is that people will look at the same thing and they will see something different. And if we don't share a view of the facts, which is extremely easy, if we don't share a view of the facts, then we'll just sit there and debate the facts endlessly. People will break even deeper into tribes. Researching you has been so eye-opening to see, like, oh, people just get into encampments and you can watch the comments and people are just like, it is as if they're watching a sporting match. And it's like, well, if they're on team Omar, then they're, whatever you say, they're just stoked for it. They already believe in it. They're cheering for you. Like, you either did good or bad. Like, oh, you dunked on him here, you embarrassed him there. And the other side's doing the exact same thing. And I'm like, wow, this isn't a sport. By allowing yourself to engage with this like a sport is going to leave us here. But again, bringing it back to Cyprus and many other places that have had a similar thing, I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying that there weren't tragedies stacked on tragedies. I'm just saying, what is it about this one?
I wish I had a note, a paper and pen to, because I had so many things that it's all right at this point. Just I had so many things as you were talking of things that I would like to kind of address. Look, I don't think that people see eye to eye on the conflicts that have been solved. That's not the point of contrast. It's not as if everybody agreed about, Cyprus and Turkey and Greece, and that's why that has been solved. I think there's still going to be diverging perspectives. For me, what's wrong with Palestine and Israel and why it feels intractable, it's still ongoing, right? You can talk about refugee situations that happened so many years ago. If the conflict is settled, then yes, all you have is memories and, remembering what it's like to have lived once in this village, and you don't anymore, and it's a little sad, but it's not a continuous source of tension. And the problem is that we have not resolved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I come back to the fact that the reason why we have not resolved it is because there is an imbalance of power that keeps it from being resolved. Compromise happens when both sides have a reason to compromise. And what you have right now is one side destroying the other and paying a relatively minimal price, right? That's what was unique about October 7th, is that Israel, for the first time in a very, very long time, paid a significant cost for the fact that they are denying Palestinians freedom and human rights. For the most part, the way Israel has existed for most of the past several decades is U.S. provided impunity. And U.S. provided immunity means they get to do whatever the hell they want to at minimal cost, and that creates a dynamic in which you cannot solve the problem. You've had negotiators from the American team, Aaron David Miller, during the peace process negotiations, whose complaint was, far too often we behaved like Israel's lawyer. Those were his words. And the U.S. is not being a reasonable mediator that is trying to bring two sides together. They're saying, the pressure is on one side. The idea that what Israel wants is reasonable, what Palestinian wants, oh, come on, it's too much. Why don't you guys just settle for this? Shouldn't you be happy that we're giving you something? There's a constant attitude that Palestinians ought to be happy with crumbs while enabling Israel to do whatever it wants that keeps this conflict from being solved. On the question of sports and comments, by the way, I think that's a really fascinating conversation, because I do think that this is one of the ways in which social media has kind of ruined our discourse in one of many ways, really. And the idea is that we trivialize these things to the point to where people, that's how they engage with them, that you end the search for solutions, for serious, meaningful engagement. For me, and that's my criticism, for example, of somebody like Destiny, is Destiny, from my perspective, is not a particularly well-informed on this topic, and yet one of the most difficult and challenging opponents I've ever debated on this topic. He's just really good at it. It's a natural talent. I think you've described him at some point as having high intellectual horsepower, which I think is correct. But it does not feel like there is investment. Sort of there is a huge consumption of Israeli talking points and a way to throw these things back at you in order to win an argument. The human shields being an obvious one. If the Israeli Supreme Court is siding against the Israeli military on this practice, they're calling it human shields, and they're saying it's wrong and needs to stop. What's the incentive for somebody like Destiny to go, oh no, actually it's not so bad, it's just fine, and siding with the Israeli military against the Israeli Supreme Court? From my perspective, it seems like if you're engaging with this in good faith, that's an easy one to say, okay, fine, you're right about that. But some people do argue for the sake of arguing. It does feel like it's about teams, and I'm going to prove that I'm going to win this argument by, owning you and shutting you down and dunking on you and so on. And that has manifested in a way that I think is really, really unhelpful. And you see people sometimes even talk about politics in a way that is similar to sports of, we cheer for the different teams, but then after the game, we're just still pals and high five. And for me, genocide in Gaza is not the kind of thing in which we can just have a small minor disagreement and, oh yay, we debated and everything is great. Like for me, this is really meaningful and consequential, and it nothing comes as important and to the topic of the mass slaughter of a people. And that to me is not something that you can overcome as the way that you would talk about just cheering for two different teams at a sporting event and just getting along afterwards. As much as I try to say that I think we have too much polarization and division, but for me, also part of it, there ought to be fundamental human decency, that there is a wide range of topics in which I can disagree with someone and we can still be friends. One of my closest friends is obsessed with the Second Amendment and thinks owning AR-15s is really important. I don't agree at all, but it's not a problem between us that we can have this disagreement, because for me, there isn't fundamental indecency at the core of somebody who believes certain things in a way that for me, to be morally fine with what's happening in Gaza feels like something much, much more serious, that it's more difficult for me to kind of overlook and treat like a sport.
Okay. Have you ever run the thought exercise of, have you ever heard of loving kindness meditation?
I have not.
It sounds dumb, but it is so useful. Mm-hmm. So loving kindness meditation is where you sit and you meditate and you imagine yourself pushing a bubble of love out. Mm-hmm. Every time I explain this, it sounds so dumb, but it really works. It's a bubble that envelops you, and you have love for yourself and then your family and then your friends and then your neighbors. And then eventually you try to push the bubble out to the whole world. Yeah. I would love a man that understands this conflict as well as you do to find threads of connection to a well-intentioned person that has the diehard Israel mentality. Mm-hmm. Because if, this is sort of the great man of history. So arguably my greatest hero is Nelson Mandela. And what I found fascinating about Nelson Mandela was when he came out of prison, his whole thing was about unity, and he wanted to bring people together. And so it is going to take people on both sides that see a path together. And right now, what I see are really smart people on both sides that see why the other side is an asshole. Why, and that's trivial, why the other side is hell-bent on killing and death, and that the other side is so wrong-headed and wants to kill us that we can never truly find peace. And I hear that coming out of both sides. So I know how naive and cheesy this sounds, but I actually don't know. I don't know that there's another way. There is a very mechanistic way, which is if you can get a human to believe that tomorrow will be better than today, and if they take a certain set of actions, they can bring that about. There's hardwiring in the human mind that will pull you forward on that. Mm-hmm. Now, the only thing I don't understand the religions on either side enough to know if that normal injection point breaks.
Yeah.
And so my stepmother-in-law, for instance, gets kicked out of her home. becomes a refugee. She ends up moving to England, studying, finding love, having kids. And she just was like, I'm just going to focus on the future. I'm going to focus on beautiful things. And I'm just not going to think about that. And they lost everything. So it's like, that would have been brutal. But she switched her view to something more positive. Mm-hmm. And so I would love for somebody of your knowledge and wisdom to find those points of connection to this is so as a CEO, you end up mediating for these incredible humans that you have on your team, but you're watching them and you're like, how dumb can one human act? This is really crazy. What the fuck are you guys doing? And I have learned that you have to find a way for them to have what I call an exit ramp. People talked a lot about this with Putin, but you never hear people, or at least I don't, never hear people talking about this with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it goes something like this. You have a worldview. I'm not going to convince you to see my worldview. I know that. So now I need to figure out how I find an off-ramp for you where you don't look like an asshole in front of your constituents.
Yeah.
And that has to happen on both sides. And so that everybody can feel good moving forward. And every time I try to imagine that, I keep running into what, even after hearing your arguments and even being able to articulate your arguments back to you, it feels like there's an invisible thing that I have not hit yet. At this point in the conversation, I suspect it's religious in nature, but I don't know that. And so no one wants the off-ramp. Now, I took a note a minute ago. This could be the most naive question that I've asked in a series of naive questions. Is this really all just about the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the West Bank, and that's really the game? And until we settle that, everything else is a charade?
So I don't think so. I think that religion amplifies the tensions a little bit, but I don't think that this is the fundamental issue at the end of the day. By the way, just for the record, Palestinian Christians are just as oppressed as Palestinian Muslims. So this is not like a uniquely Muslim-Jewish thing. I know some people try to paint it that way, but some of the most prominent people advocating for Palestinian rights are Palestinian Christians. Edward Said, Hanan Ashrawi, the list, even in the United States, so many, somebody quit the Biden administration over Biden's policy towards Israel and Palestine. It was a guy by the name of Tariq Habash, who is Christian. So I don't think that religion really is at the core of this, but obviously it inflames tensions a little bit more. I think that it is ultimately about a better future in which people can envision their children having a way to live in that land in dignity and freedom. I think that is ultimately at its core. And it's a status quo in which one people get that and the other don't. And we're trying to figure out how to get past that. Now, you bring up the love thing, which I don't think is cheesy at all, by the way. I do think that it's one of the primary critiques that I have of, I think it's our political discourse in general, but certainly exists within my camp as well, is kind of seeing people who disagree with us or who are uninformed as the enemy in some way. And for me, I think that disinformation and misinformation are the enemy. And sure, there are powers that propagate that intentionally. And for me, that's the opponent. But ultimately, when I think of your average uninformed person who just doesn't know enough and gets it wrong, just because that's the media that is available in the mainstream, frankly, that's what people consume. To me, it is absolutely critical to reach to those people with love and kindness. And that does extend to people who are on the other side of this issue. And there is a way in which I've seen it. A close personal friend of mine is a Russian Jewish guy who's talking to a lot of his family members who are Israeli, and he's having that struggle internally and trying to figure out how he can convince them that Israel is on the wrong track and that Israeli policy is wrong and so on. And he's run into a ton of resistance. He's within the community. He's not an outsider of his community. And so I don't think that this is really the dividing line, that I'm simply at the point to where, while I completely acknowledge that approaching the things with our common humanity and decency and the kindness that we show one another in interactions is incredibly helpful of resolving personal tensions. And you can absolutely get to a place to where with people that you have very, very strong political, moral, whatever disagreements with, you can get to a place to where you see each other's humanity really well. The scale of what we're witnessing in Palestine and Israel cannot wait for these kinds of personal connections to like eventually develop into something. To me, this is a moment of international accountability. So and for what it's worth, by the way, personally, I've identified as agnostic. I don't believe in anything anymore. And I just keep coming back to the fact that we have a situation in which to try to resolve this through love and kindness is possible, but there is an urgency to ending what is unfolding right now that can't wait for us to naturally develop positive feelings and let things play out and see how we can do this through personal connections. There is an apartheid regime condemned by every major human rights organization in the world. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Israeli human rights organizations critical of their own government, the United Nations, Human Rights Council, you name it. Consensus on the fact that this is an apartheid regime practicing an illegal occupation and committing, whether you want to agree on the word genocide or not, certainly unspeakable war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's not in dispute. And there is a question right now whether we should continue arming them or not. There is a time for love and personal connection, but there's an urgency to saying we have to put an end to this. And you put an end to it by making sure that you don't have the weapons to carry on these atrocities anymore. And then after that is settled, after you put an end to the emergency that is unfolding, when we no longer have thousands of people being killed on a regular basis, then we can sit down and talk about how to build a meaningful connection between Israelis and Palestinians. I keep going back to apartheid South Africa because I think that's a really, really important example of truth and reconciliation came after apartheid fell. Mandela became a uniting figure after the political injustice was undone, and he led by example of how to be uniting and not to regurgitate old traumas and hatreds and so on. And you have a scale of an injustice that is unfolding before our eyes. It is simply premature to be talking about building personal connections and understanding each other in the face of something this horrific that is unfolding. And just on the question of genocide, I know that the word invokes a lot of feelings and people dispute it. To me, there is Aryeh Nair. His family fled the Holocaust. He's Jewish, was born in Germany, founded Human Rights Watch, headed the ACLU for a while, and kind of just the respect that people have for him as an authority on these kinds of issues is unparalleled. And he said at the beginning of this, I thought Israel was only committing war crimes in Gaza. I thought that they were reckless in the way they were targeting civilians. But after examining this a little bit more closely and seeing the systematic starvation and destruction of society in Gaza, I can't help but conclude that this is a genocide. I know this is one person's opinion, but it's not a random person. Somebody who is Jewish, is an authority on these kinds of issues, and started with sympathy for Israel and wanting to make excuses for Israel's conduct, and could not help by looking at the fact but conclude that Israel is systematically destroying society, Palestinian society in Gaza.
Well, now let's really complicate the issue and go back to what you were saying about this is a moment for international intervention. Mm-hmm. I have a hypothesis as a layman that isn't going to work. And the reason I don't think that that's going to work is it hasn't worked so far. And Israel seems like they are more than prepared to continue to escalate. And Iran is lurking somewhere in the background. So I think it is necessary to confront the Iran of it all. What is Iran's role in this moment?
Yep. I will push back just on your setup and I'll get to Iran real quick. I don't think we've ever tried meaningful pressure on Israel. There have been a few occasions in the distant past. There was a time in which Ronald Reagan warned Israel to instantly put an end to their bombing of Beirut and Lebanon because they were causing immense casualties. And it's crazy to think that, talk about how much our political discourse shifted. Reagan compared it to the Holocaust and said you have to put an end to it. And Israel immediately pulled the plug because they understood that Reagan was really putting his foot down in a very serious way.
Pause. Yeah. So we've been in this situation since the end of World War II, effectively. So. Yeah. No, literally in whatever 70 years.
Yeah, but we need consistency. That's the thing, right? Like we have the individual instances, but if the U.S. puts its foot down,
there's a reason. So this is why nations build alliances. That I'm sure there are things that Israel has to offer to other people that makes them not want to abandon their ally. So for whatever reason, which admittedly on this I literally know nothing. But if I look at the way that they're being treated, I say, okay, well, clearly there's a mutually beneficial relationship, even if I don't understand it.
Yes and no. So, right, when you think of why the relationship became what it was, the special relationship, it came on the back of the 1967 war, in which Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 6 days and just like blew everybody out of the water, captured all this massive territory. They tripled their size. And I think the US was interested in being allies with a country that is that powerful. And so they thought this is a good, the US had different countries in different parts of the world that play regional cop, basically local cops. And having Israel be that for the United States seemed like a no-brainer. And so Israeli military funding, US military funding for Israel jumped 100-fold very, very quickly after that. And that is the natural alliance, is that you have a region that is strategically important. They've got a lot of oil in the region, very important resource for the world. And you want to be allied with a government which, in contrast to other, like, for example, the Saudi government is allied with the US. But the government does not represent its people. It's an authoritarian regime. And so there's the possibility of them being overthrown and things could switch overnight the way they happened in Iran. There was an Iranian dictator that was close with the United States. We actually overthrew an Iranian democratic prime minister, Mossadegh, back in the 1950s, installed the Shah, who was brutal. And then there was this Islamic revolution more recently that overthrew the US-backed dictator. So there's a fear that this thing could happen when we ally ourselves exclusively with authoritarian governments that don't really represent their people. And Israel offered a unique opportunity for us to be allied with a government that effectively does represent its people. It's more or less democratic for its Jewish population. And there was some level of stability and military power that came together that made sense for us to be close with them. Now, I've examined it. Interestingly, this is what I wrote my master's thesis on. It's sort of like, because you had a lot of arguments of people saying the US doesn't benefit anything from Israel. Israel's taking advantage of the US, is the tail wagging the dog. It's a backwards relationship. And you've had many other people on the other side of this saying, no. Israel is there to serve US interests. That's why there is an alliance, and the US as an imperial force benefits from having Israel. And I wanted to resolve what that relationship was and how it actually works. And I noticed that there's a contrast between what Israel does in Palestine versus when Israel oversteps on major significant US strategic interests. So when they tried to sell military technology to China back in 2005, George W. Bush took a stance, very aggressive one, refused to meet with Israeli diplomats and told them they need to back off. And they backed off and they issued a public apology. So you can see that the US is in charge when it matters. But then when it comes to how Israel treats the Palestinians, there isn't an overriding strategic reason why the US cares about Palestinians. And this is where you see the Israel lobby in the US bully the US administration on multiple occasions. You had it in 2002. You have it with the building of settlements in general. You constantly have the US telling Israel, you need to stop these provocative acts of building settlements and put an end to it. And Israel just constantly kicks sands in the US face and just keeps expanding settlements. They did not run up against a collection of US strategic interests that would come together to push the Israel lobby down. So in a way, I can admit that Israel is useful to the US in some ways, but I'll say that what Israel is doing in Palestine is 100% harmful to US interests. There's no reason to back it up. And this is where the Israel lobby has an outsized influence. They have a ton of money. They're not afraid to show it. They brag about it. There was a time in which somebody who worked at AIPAC, talking to Jeffrey Goldberg, a pro-Israel journalist at The Atlantic, pulled up a napkin off the table and said, see this napkin, within 24 hours, I can get the signatures of 70 senators on it. Just kind of bragging at the fact that they can get their way. And that's because they do spend their money and they push their weight around in Washington. They oust members of Congress who are critical of Israel and they try to support people who are. Their power has diminished slightly. There's a change in public opinion in America where young people really diverge from the older generation and they're beginning to really push back on the Israel lobby in some ways. But to me, that dynamic on why we back them when they do what they do in the West Bank and Gaza, that is absolutely not in America's interest. And that is the Israel lobby bullying American politicians into going along with it, to the point to where we've created a political culture in the US where our politicians sound like robots. No matter what you ask them, it's like, I support Israel, has the right to defend itself, two-state solution. It's just an empty slogan that doesn't mean anything. They just say it in response to anything that they're asked about, like kind of glitching bots. And that's kind of where you can tell that this is not, this isn't driven by any kind of American strategy where we have a vision of where we want to go and not. And Biden keeps leaking to the press that he has frustrations with Netanyahu and why won't he do this and why won't he do that? And he tells him your bombing in Gaza is indiscriminate and it goes too far. And Rafah is a red line. And time and again, Netanyahu disregards him. And you have a US administration that is basically worried about picking a fight with the Israel lobby. And what that looks like is the Israel lobby mobilizing pro-Israel members of Congress to attack the administration for quote unquote being too hard on Israel. They just don't want to deal with it. The Palestinians don't seem like a significant enough reason to invest this political capital. Like in defense of Palestinians, let's not have this fight. We have other national priorities. And that's part of how Israel keeps moving in a more extreme direction. We keep indulging it when it doesn't really serve American interests, even if fundamentally there is an alliance there that makes sense in a different set of circumstances.
Well, I think that whether they serve America's interests is going to come down to, some of this could just be money and politics. So setting that aside for now, but serving America's interests, again, coming back to Iran.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I missed your main question.
No, not at all. But I do want to better understand that. So you've got Iran that's obviously been pushing for years to try and become a nuclear power, which less nuclear powers would be better, not more.
For what it's worth, not nuclear weapons. It seems like everybody who's investigated Iran have said that they're not in the process of developing nuclear weapons. They are developing peaceful nuclear energy that then has the potential of being shifted into weapons capacity, but there's been zero evidence of the fact that they're developing nuclear weapons. I just think that that's a note that is worth raising, simply because Israel is a nuclear armed country, and we constantly have this discourse about how our friend can have it, but our foes can't. And that's a double standard that we ought to question as well.
Well, I mean, now just speaking as somebody that lives in America, yes, our friends can have what they want and our foes get nothing. That I think would be weird to approach any other way. But going back to, okay, so one, if you're looking sideways at Iran, which I suppose I am, in as much as it makes me tense the tensions between the US and Iran. So I'm always a little skeptical, but I don't know enough about Iran, so I'm certainly on exploratory mission here. But it doesn't seem crazy to think that you develop as much of your program as you can under the guise of energy, and then if you get a chance, you switch over to the weapons. So I've heard it said that what's really going on with Israel and Lebanon, what's going on with Israel and Gaza is actually about Iran trying to create a 7 or 8 front war against Israel to weaken them so that they can, I don't know, at some point launch an all-out offensive, take them over, eliminate them as a state. What's your take on that? Is that just crazy talk, or?
It's got elements that are accurate, but the cohesive picture I think is not. And I think that here's a way to think about it. Just think of the relationship between the US and Israel. It's an alliance. There's a patron. The US is the patron. We're the ones who give them all the money and weapons. But that doesn't mean that Israel does whatever the US wants. It doesn't mean that every time Israel does something, that's the US moving them. And there's a similar relationship between Iran and a bunch of groups in the region. And again, just the history that I recounted is relevant, because this all started with the US overthrowing a democratic government in Iran, installing a brutal dictator, and then this revolution that came, a religious revolution that overthrew the US-backed dictator, and extreme hostility towards the US and the hostage crisis and all that. Like, obviously, we're familiar with the history. And now you have in the region kind of there's really 3 teams, if you want to think about it, but there are 2 main teams. One is the US team, and that's Israel and other governments that are allied in one form or another with the US. That's the Egyptian government, the Jordanian government, the Saudi government, the Emirati government, and so on. And you have then an axis that what they call themselves the axis of resistance, which is resistance to US empire and hegemony in the region. And that is Iran and its allies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen right now as the kind of like the counterforce. And they have narratives. I mean, ultimately, this is about geopolitics. This is about countries that want to spread their influence in the region. And Iran has a pretty powerful narrative that is built on the injustice that Palestinians are suffering. And it gives them enormous leverage in a region that is deeply frustrated with the way Israel is getting away with treating Palestinians the way it does. And this is a major point of weakness for the United States, that we talk all this lofty rhetoric about freedom and democracy and human rights, and yet we're arming and funding the destruction of Palestinian society with the most horrible abuses and the denial of freedom for Palestinians. That, speaking out of both sides of our mouths, has not gone unnoticed on the region. And so even the populations of rulers that are pro-US, they're terrified of their populations on this particular question. So you have the Egyptian government, the rhetoric is anti-Israel, even though the policy is effectively pro-Israel. The same thing with Jordan. The majority of people who live in Jordan are of Palestinian origin. And the US is putting its allies in the region in a very, very difficult spot, where they want to be allied with the US, but the price is so high in terms of public opinion, and Iran is capitalizing on that in a very, very aggressive way. And so they do have a patronage relationship with some of the powers like Hezbollah and the Houthis, where they supply them with weapons and money. But I think it would be wrong to describe these as simply an extension of Iran or tools of Iran. Hezbollah in Lebanon is an authentic Lebanese organization and political movement, and they represent a significant portion of the Lebanese society. The same thing with the Houthis in Yemen. They represent a significant portion of the Yemeni population. And because they're willing to take a more antagonistic role with Israel and the United States and the Saudi government and so on, Iran is more than happy to jump on that and provide backing and assistance. So it's a natural alliance, in a sense, of these two axes. And if you want to weaken, again, you keep coming back to the same issue, which is that if you're interested in weakening violent political movements in Palestine that are saying liberation can only come through violence, if you want to weaken your regional foes, resolving the issue of Palestine is an obvious low-hanging fruit. And day in and day out, the US says we support a two-state solution. The UN takes a vote on the two-state solution. The US intervenes and vetoes. And Iran says, look, they're hypocrites. It's just all lofty American rhetoric. But when push comes to shove, they're more than happy to arm and continue and defend the apartheid regime that rules Israel and all the crimes that they are committing. And that's a very, very potent thing. So from a purely geopolitical perspective, no denying that Iran does play a role in the fact that they are the major power in that axis that is defiant towards the US and Israel. A way to undermine them would be to take away the biggest grievance that the region has, which is the question of Palestine and lack of freedom for Palestinians.
Okay, if for Hamas to stay in place and us actually solve this so we could remove from Iran their biggest weapon, could peace ever happen with Hamas still in place?
I believe so. And that's a reference. I mean, I don't know how long that'll take at this point. Obviously, things are in a very, very different place. But it's that signaling towards moderation that happened when they won the election in 2006. Jimmy Carter was in talks with Hamas and reported back that he sees that there's potential to work with them, verified that the election was democratic and that they're basically willing to moderate and play ball. We're many, many years removed from that. So I can't tell you that you can snap your finger and everything goes back to normal. But to me, rather, this obsession with removing Hamas from power, I think, is extremely misguided. If we say that groups that commit mass atrocities must be eliminated for peace to move forward, the obvious logical conclusion of that is you have to eliminate the Israeli government, because no party in this entire region between the river and the sea in Palestine has committed greater atrocities than the Israeli military has. But we don't think that's a reasonable starting point. We don't say you have to decapitate the Israeli government, then we can talk peace. You accept that this is an existing structure, and part of what you do is that you have to make peace with unsavory characters, and that means sitting down and talking. I think it's very similar. I think that there is reasonable reservations that people have on Hamas. It's not crazy to think that they're not the most prone towards flexibility and negotiation or anything like that. But at the same time, they're the structure that exists. And I think that engaging them as a step towards trying to find a solution, a peaceful solution, I think is a reasonable way to move forward.
How do you deal with the fact that they've said we'll do October 7th over and over and over?
Oh boy, if I wanted to recount to you how many genocidal Israeli statements have been made by Israeli leaders, the list is endless. it's not about what rhetoric people use at any given point. I think it's about whether you think that there's room to move people or not. And starting with something as simple as a ceasefire, they're saying we'll give up all the hostages, just end the war. And then Netanyahu found a reason to say no to that. They insisted on a temporary ceasefire. And then finally, Hamas buckled under American pressure on the Qatari government and said, okay, fine, temporary 6-week ceasefire, and we'll give you back the hostages. And Israel still found a reason to say no, because they said they want to leave troops in Gaza to control this corridor and that corridor and what have you. So I think you start with, again, ending the onslaught, getting a basic and simple agreement as a ceasefire, and then we can see where we can go from there towards building some kind of comprehensive peace agreement. But along the way in which this has been promising, the primary obstacle has always been the Israeli government. It has been for decades now that they are the primary impediment towards resolving the conflict. And you see it in the UN votes. That's where it's a major demonstration. The UN General Assembly votes on the question of Palestine. It's always the entire world on one side saying Israel has to withdraw from the occupied territories. And then the US and Israel and a couple of tiny countries that they've bullied into voting along with them. There's a sharp contrast between the way the way people around the world view this. And we really are an outlier in our insistence on Israel blocking the possibility of a peaceful solution and insisting that the only way, the American rhetoric, the only way there's going to be peace is through negotiations. Well, you've got an imbalance of power between two parties, and you've watched what it looks like when they negotiate. Palestinians were never consulted when Israel was created. They never had to okay it. Why is it that Israel has to okay a Palestinian state? Why is that a requirement from one side and not the other? And instead, we just keep funding this occupation indefinitely and saying only when Israel feels good about having those talks and having them lead somewhere is when something could happen.
Yeah, this is where I think your worldview of this is largely, not exclusively, but this is largely a moral question, and they need to do the right thing, runs into realpolitik, that this is Israel is in a much stronger position, both militarily and in an alliance perspective. And so I imagine some of this is just they're not going to give up something that they don't absolutely need to give up. Again, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying
you're right.
This is where...
That's the thing. I think what you're saying is absolutely correct, which is where the two-state solution compromise came from. There, for a lot of Palestinians, two states where they only get the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem is just, a lot of people actually consider it unacceptable. They think it's way too far a compromise that you give up the overwhelming majority of historic Palestine that Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from. And yet it was the position of the Palestinian leadership and had the support of public opinion of Palestinians who lived in the occupied territories for a reason. It is that recognition of the fact that there is an imbalance of power and we have to compromise. It just can't be you live in a cage. That's the compromise Palestinians are not willing to go for. They're willing to go for a reasonable two-state solution based on the 67 borders, even though that is ceding a lot. That is a major Palestinian compromise.
All right, let's run a
because
thought
of that.
experiment. So, all right, let's say that we could convince Israel, guys, this is dumb. You've been fighting over this for a very long time. If you have a secret desire, you're going to take everything over. We, America, are going to pull out, never going to let it happen. So now it's time for you guys to... you have to end the blockade. You've got to let these guys start doing their own thing, building a life for themselves. And let's fantasy land. America says, Israel, we love you to death. And we are so glad that you're our special partner. But we are now a big hammer. And if either one of you messes with the other, we smash down on whoever did the bad thing.
Yeah.
And what do you think would happen at that point? Because let's say that the floodgates of aid unlock again and they're flowing into Palestine. What makes me nervous is if you have Hamas in control, whenever you're hiring somebody, you always say the best predictor of future success is past success. So what did Hamas do with the funds that they got before? They built these incredible tunnels. They are really incredible. But obviously all military all the time. They didn't even let civilians in there when civilians had no place to go during the bombings. So it's like, that doesn't feel like a good use of funds. That feels like, and feel is the right word, it feels like, from my perspective, somebody who's here for justice and they are not interested in actually getting their state. So I worry that given that they did not get what they wanted, which I still don't have a clear definition. Like if they get Gaza as Gaza stands today, no new settlements, maybe even a couple quick land swaps so that they're not intermingled and you just draw a line and say...
Yeah, settlements are not an issue in Gaza right now. Like when Israel withdrew the settlers, like that was
right,
the end
this
of
is
that.
a West Bank problem.
The West Bank is a huge problem because they're very, very deeply embedded to the point to where there is almost no way to extricate them at this point.
All right, let's forget that for a second because I want to
play
follow
the thought
this.
experiment. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So do you trust... I know you have huge trust issues with Israel because you believe that they want it all and that's just the whole game. But remember, in this fantasy, America's going to act as a hammer. So if they make a move for it, boom. Do you think that Palestine would take that aid and build a thriving economy, or are we going to find ourselves with more military buildup?
No, I think we would have, and again, I'm sorry if I keep going back to this, but I think it's just such a demonstrable example of the beginning of the peace process. What the Palestinian Authority was focused on is institution building and trying to make life as normal as possible. That is where the energy was focused. And I have no doubt, and again, what happened also during that time is you had individual acts of violence. You had a Jewish extremist go into a mosque and massacre 30 people. You've had Hamas setting off suicide bombings. So you're not going to eliminate that completely.
Of course.
But the bulk of the way these societies are going to function, if there is a genuine prospect for freedom, I think it's going to be to normalize life. Because we talked about this a second ago, sort of what's at the core of this. I don't think this is religious. I don't think this is about an abstract idea of justice. I think people want to have a better future for their children. That's what this is about. And what you're describing would open the door to that. And then it would be similar to, your story with Cyprus of, yes, I'm not going to say that people are never going to think and dream of what the past used to be like and when Palestinians could go everywhere they wanted to and so on. But you can get to a point to where the primary focus of these societies is going to be a better future for their children. And when the risk, right, like if the risk of further military confrontation with Israel means that your otherwise free and prosperous children are now going to be reduced to rubble again, nobody wants that. The problem with Gaza right now is that there is such a level of despair over what life has been like for decades that it didn't seem that crazy for Hamas to be able to recruit that many people who are up to just cause trouble and see what happens. So are you ever going to get everybody to go along with an idea of a two-state solution? Probably not. You're going to get a lot of upset people. But at the same time, by offering people the chance for a better life, I have no doubt that from there, you're on much better ground to start negotiating towards a better future and building slowly towards it and dealing with security problems as security problems rather than a fundamental issue of injustice that has to be resolved.
Okay. That's a fun fantasy. Now let me drag us back into the filthy muck of reality. I saw a rabbi, wrote his name down. Rabbi Fleischer on Piers Morgan said something along the lines of, this is a wild paraphrase, but something along the lines of, the way that a war ends is one side wins and the other side loses. And Israel is going to win. We are going to defeat Hamas. And when we do, we are going to take security control over Gaza. We are going to run it with other players in the region. Egypt, I don't remember if he said Jordan, definitely said Saudi Arabia. And we're going to help rebuild Gaza and end up with a Gaza that is terror-free, and it will end up being wonderful. So in that vision, which I know you find wildly unjust and absolutely horrifying.
Not just that, by the way, just that he's fundamentally dishonest because his track record is extremely lengthy about saying that Israel should take control of all the land and that it should reoccupy Gaza and permanently take it over.
Oh, he sounded like he was saying that.
Yeah, okay.
In no uncertain terms.
Yeah.
The only difference I would say is he was making it sound like, in what I saw, that this would be done with other nations in the region, and that the goal would be to build it back up and have something. He didn't say two-state, but that was what I chose to read into it, maybe?
Yeah, certainly not. No, he's fundamentally opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state, and for him, Israel should be in control of everything. And it is that formula of
control of everything forever.
From the river to the sea forever, this is Israel's land. He has a very religious take on it. Believe it or not, the first time I debated him was back in 2011 or something. Like it's a while back.
You've been at this for a minute.
Yeah. And yeah, he's got very, very deep religious convictions that this can all be done through strength, and it should all be Israeli conquest of the entire land. And frankly, I'm almost convinced that he thinks of October 7th as a great opportunity for Israel to finally do what he's always wanted it to do, which is to reconquer Gaza.
Got it. So that is a nightmare scenario for you, even if Gaza is rebuilt back into something beautiful and the many players in the region are overseeing everything.
Yeah, I mean, what is it?
Nightmare.
To me, it's Palestinian freedom. That's what we want at the end of it, right? Like, you could have that. Now, you don't need to go through this entire charade. Just Palestinians deserve to have freedom. They should rule themselves. They should have control of their own borders. If Israel is attached to the idea of holding on to the entire territory, fine, but then you have to give Palestinians equal rights. You can't have them held there as subjects who don't get to vote for the government that rules them.
All right, so
having it both ways is the problem of no state and no freedom.
Let's run then the other thought experiment where they're given rights in that tiered system that you were talking about. It's no longer an open air prison. Israel is putting a ton of money into rebuilding. International aid is flowing in like crazy, but there's no more Hamas because they were soundly defeated. Money's pouring in. It's a coalition government, for lack of a better word, because I don't want it. In the thought experiment, I don't want it to be just Israel. That feels bad.
Yeah.
So it's a coalition government, and we're rebuilding Gaza. They have equal rights in this new the tiered rights.
Yeah.
Just to make it a little more complicated, a little more realistic.
So you're describing basically everybody in the occupied territories as being currently Palestinian citizens of Israel. That tier, that kind of,
Yeah. Is that dire, tragic, nothing good? Or is it still bad, but boy, oh boy, is it better than what we have now?
Would be substantially better. And the biggest obstacle to that would be Israel would never allow it to happen. That's where we are. Because if you can imagine, if the majority, if everybody in the occupied territories has full voting rights now, the way Palestinian citizens of Israel do, Israel can no longer basically make decisions in advance of one particular group. You know, there's a vote that happens in the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, every once in a while, in which Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset, Palestinian citizens of Israel, put forth a bill that says, let's define Israel as a country of all its citizens. So that's not even the occupied territories. It's just defining it as a country of all its citizens, and the parliament shoots it down every single time. Sometimes they don't even let it come to a vote because they don't think that Palestinian citizens of Israel, that this is their country. They're kind of like a tolerated people within who have citizenship.
Does that come from, do you think, a Jewish superiority position?
Oh, explicitly so. There's something called the Israel nation state law, in which it says the right to self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people. That's explicit. So they don't have a constitution in Israel.
You could read that not as like because we're better, but knowing a bit of the history about why they suddenly felt so compelled to have a state. It's like, we've had pogroms for however long. That's going to set a thing in your psyche. We just had the Holocaust. We're starting a nation. We will do whatever the fuck it takes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure not all of it was good, but we end up getting our state. Now I'm like, I am not going to let anybody mess this up. And if that means that I've got to tier my system, I'm going to tier my system. But I'm even going to put into words that like self-determination is only for the Jewish people. That way I don't even have to worry. Yeah. Like if we end up getting outnumbered one day, it is what it is. Like the Constitution, I guess not that, but whatever their founding document is, says that it's just for us to make decisions.
Yeah.
I get why they would want that. I also get why that's
But here's the
icky.
It's two things, right? There's the motivation of why they're doing it, and then there's just the reality that they've created with that. Smotrich, who's currently part of Netanyahu's government, his view, by the way, interestingly enough, he calls himself a homophobic fascist or a fascist homophobe. I don't remember which word. This is his own self-description of
ensemble.
himself.
I'm not sure what we're wearing there, but okay.
His position is we need to separate Palestinian citizens of Israel from Jewish babies in maternity wards.
Wait, say that one more time?
He wants to separate Arab and Jewish babies in maternity wards.
He just doesn't want them in the same room?
Yes.
Okay.
So you can tell it comes from very deep racism and the idea that we're not the same people. So like that, those are people currently in government. The guy in charge of Israeli national security, Ben Gvir, he was convicted, and it just tells you also again about the slide of the Israeli mindset over time. He was convicted by an Israeli court of terrorism and anti-Arab incitement, and currently he's serving in this government as the head of national security. things have moved in a very, very dark and ugly direction in terms of anti-Palestinian sentiment. So like that's the driving force for a lot of that. It's the idea that these people are not equal to us, and therefore we should find ways to get rid of them or confine them, or if they want to stay here, fine, just you don't have rights and you have to take it. That is the attitude with which they view Palestinians. So all of it is geared towards reducing their rights. And yeah, at every turn, it's an apartheid regime through and through, and public opinion is not shifting in a better direction, but in a worse one. So
I know nothing about the things you're describing right now, but I know humans well enough to know that just like in America, you can fix it. Psychopaths.
Yeah.
That
they're not usually in charge of government, though. The people who express views, like obviously we have a ton of racist people in this country.
Are you kidding? So
Fair enough.
But I mean this in this way. Half of the country thinks that Donald Trump is the next Hitler. So what I'm getting at is you've got literally America is good people on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I've got red and blue, and boy, oh boy, do I not agree with a lot of them. But it is interesting at the deepest level that half of these incredible people can look at Trump and say, this is the next coming of Hitler. And we're making jokes when he almost got assassinated. And then the other half looks at him as the savior and is the only thing saving our country from certain demise. I get whiplash. As somebody who is constitutionally center, I get whiplash seeing that. But I understand that even from within my own country, people will look left and to the right and see just insanity. Like they can't believe it. These people have to be stopped at all costs. So I understand how in a democracy, you're going to get this kind of thing. So I don't doubt for 1 second that inside of Israel are people who are like, you need to separate these babies because they are beneath us. They're horrible. Get them away. But I've got to believe that there's also a huge swath of people that are, I want beautiful things for everybody that comes in contact with Israel, and that this is really a question of assimilation. And I need to look at the tiered system because I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. But I get the protectionary impulse. In practice, it just may be too gross. But I understand how, again, with all the persecution that they've had for thousands of years, I get how you're like, okay, line in the sand. But my gut instinct is that again, I am not educated in this. This is just me speaking about what I know to be true about humans. Yeah. That I have a feeling that it's not all one side or the other, that there are going to be people that want to see everybody united, but assimilation will be important.
Yeah. There's a line between, right? It's never, you don't want to view things in black and white, good people and bad people and all that stuff. Like there is no strict dividing line, but there are injustices of a scale where it does require you to take that kind of position. Like for me, if you were to look back at Jim Crow and think, oh, the black-white conflict in America is so awful, but there are good people on both sides, and if you can only get together and whatever. Yes, like maybe there are good individual people on both sides, sure, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the fact that there is a political injustice, and that's what we're describing here, is that, of course, there are tons of good Israelis who are well-intentioned and so on. Public opinion is shifting in a negative direction, so there's more of the ones who don't view Palestinians as equals fundamentally. But nonetheless, of course, there are good people, but we are looking at a fundamental injustice. We are at a juncture right now in which you have a historic atrocity being committed. We've seen those being committed before. Were there good Germans in Nazi Germany? Of course there were. Were there good Russians in Stalin's Russia, in the Soviet Union? Of course there were. But you're confronting a massive atrocity right now where it's not about finding common ground. It is about putting an end to an absolute horror that is unfolding. And that's the thing that I keep going back to. You know, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned something about, of course, our friend, we were talking about it in the context of Iran and Israel. Of course, our friend get to have whatever they want and our opponents don't. But we're trying to preach an international order that we want everybody to come together under. That's the idea after World War II, is that we created the UN and the international institutions and the Nuremberg trials. And the idea is from now on, the same rules apply for everyone. And it's a fundamental principle, I think it's called the principle of moral universality, which is if something is right for me, it's right for you. If I can say you can't do it, then by definition, I also should not be able to do it as an international order. And running the world the way the US currently wants to, which is our friends get to do whatever they want, including carry out genocide, and it's not a big deal. We'll just softly tell them, can you please tone it down? But then our opponents, the second they step out of line in any direction, we're mobilizing our military and getting ready to shut them down. You're running it like a mafia. You're not running a just world. And for me, looking at it from the perspective of we're trying to build a world in which we don't have as much death and suffering and injustice and misery, that has to be a world in which we say the same rules apply across the board for everyone. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, it has to mean in some fashion that Palestinians get what Israelis get. My personal preference is a one state in which everybody lives together. I understand that that might be very difficult politically to get to because of Israeli society feeling insecure about the possibility of being a Jewish minority and so on. There's an alternative to that, which is that you end the occupation. And for me, it is utterly inexcusable that somebody can simultaneously say we're too afraid to give Palestinians equality while insisting on ruling over them and never letting them have their own state and their own freedom because of the way you feel. Feelings are valid. It's fine that you feel the way you feel. You're not entitled based on your feelings to go and violate somebody else's rights and deny them. If I don't like my neighbor, if I'm suspicious of what my neighbor might be doing inside their home, I have the right to feel that. I don't have the right to go install cameras in his house and say, I don't know what you're doing. I don't feel safe with you next to me. There's a line that has to be drawn somewhere. And we can't build our international relations based on the feelings of people within a country. We have to say, you don't get to oppress other people and deny them their rights because of the way you feel. That ought to be a clear line that we draw in the sand.
All right, fully acknowledging that you believe that what happened on October the 7th was because Israel made it very clear, you guys have no other options. You will never taste freedom again. This is forever. How should Israel have responded to that invasion? I don't know what word you want to put on it.
I think it's fair. It's a major attack. And again, like had it been, I know I've niche arguments about the justification for the attack or not. Had it been exclusively on the Israeli military bases, I think there could have been an argument to be made that this is an act of resistance. This is a foreign occupation army. By the way, on a technicality, the siege, the UN and many human rights organizations consider it a continuation of the occupation, even though they withdrew settlers from within, just because they're effectively in control of all of Gaza. Had this been an attack exclusively on the Israeli military, I think you could have said that this is an act of resistance. But because it included an attack on Israeli civilians as well, it's just transparently not justified, and there's no way to justify it. But if I were Israel's leader the day it happened and you said, what would you do now? For me, it's really easy. I would come, take on the podium and say, we've realized that we've created a situation that is untenable. It is making everybody insecure and unsafe. And so we are going to end the unlawful blockade and end the illegal occupation. And in exchange, we want justice for what happened. So we want every person who has participated in the October 7th attacks, particularly the ones targeting Israeli civilians, to hand themselves over for war crimes trial. I think that's my closest approximation to justice. Is it anywhere near realistic? Are we anywhere in the vicinity of something like that happening? We are not. And it is only going to come about when Israel feels that sense that they can't behave and do whatever they want with impunity. And I really, going back to where we started, which is that you can do that through American diplomatic and financial pressure, or you can allow untold death and suffering to occur in a major regional war that's going to escalate and take many different shapes before Israel ultimately comes to that conclusion. I think that is the end result, is that because situations of injustice are inherently in a state of disequilibrium, because not everybody's satisfied and therefore they're not going to put up with it forever, we're going to end up in a situation in which there is equilibrium. And that could be, I guess, theoretically, if you want to be really morbid, the complete elimination of one side or the other, or achieving a balance in which both sides have paid such a heavy cost that they're both prepared to come to a compromise. And my problem with the current dynamic is that the Palestinians have paid an incredible cost and therefore have demonstrated a willingness to compromise and be flexible, while Israel has seen nothing but impunity for many, many years. And therefore, there is that entitlement to just do whatever they want and keep confining Palestinians to smaller and smaller places, and thinking that you can pummel Palestinians into submission, despite endless history proving that to not be the case.
All right, we're coming up on the election. Who do you think is going to be better for resolving this conflict, Kamala Harris or Trump?
So I think they're both awful on this particular issue. So it's funny because I've always been, my personal politics lean more towards Bernie Sanders on domestic issues, on foreign policy. I think the entire political establishment's kind of skewed on this. I'm to the left of the Democratic Party. And I've always believed that election day is about harm reduction. And therefore, you vote for the person who's going to reduce harm as much as possible. And for me, that has been, for most of my voting life, feeling like I need to vote Democrats because they're better on, even though their foreign policies are very similar and they're not going to drastically change anything on this question, on issues of, labor rights and the environment and so on. The Democrats seem to be a little bit more willing to challenge corporate power. They're both ultimately serving the corporate class. And yet there's some level of reform possible under Democrats in a way that I think with Republicans, from my perspective, it's just been way too accommodating for big business, denial of climate change, massive tax breaks for the wealthy, and so on. And it felt like that's leading us towards a less just society. For the first time now, and by the way, when it was time for the last election, I felt very strongly about getting Trump out of office. I thought he had been dangerous for our democracy, proved it so on January 6th and beyond. And I made a video talking about, even though I think Biden is going to be bad on Palestine, when you consider all the other ways that Trump is more harmful, it's important to get Trump out of office and to vote for Biden. That was my position. I'm really having a hard time this time around in that it feels that even though my suspicion is that Kamala Harris would be a little bit better, the scale of the violence, again, genocide, in my view, feels like a line that is harder to cross, to say I'm going to vote for the administration that has enabled genocide for the past 10 months because on balance, it might be a little bit better than the other one. There is something about me knowing directly people in my life who have lost loved ones in Gaza. A friend of mine who described his mother standing on the rubble of her home, trying to shoo away dogs for 2 days straight to keep them from eating the bodies of her children and grandchildren. To see people currently in power enable that kind of horror and to defend it at every turn and to gaslight Palestinians and to pretend they're looking for a solution even though they're arming and funding the problem, that to me is so viscerally repulsive that I'm finding it very, very difficult to say I'm going to go to the voting booth and vote for the Democrats again this time. Nonetheless, I'm also cognizant of the fact that we do have those two options, and Trump, for me, domestically, is a threat to democracy. Obviously, what he has, like people shooting at him and all that stuff should have no place in our politics. But I also believe that he's contributed to an environment in which things have moved to a more extreme direction domestically. And to try to overturn an election that you lost, to try to overturn democracy, to me is a red line. And that it's crossed, and I can't imagine a scenario in which I would vote for Donald Trump. But also on this particular question, when you look at what the Trump administration did, whatever little restrictions we had, there was a contrast between American policy in rhetoric and apparent policy in action on Palestine and Israel for many years. Our rhetoric was, we support Palestinian statehood, we opposed the Israeli occupation, we opposed Israeli settlements, but the actions were enabling all these things. Trump came along and resolved that contradiction, but in the wrong side. Instead of fixing our actions to match our correct policy positions, he changed our policy positions to match our shitty actions. So he said, settlements are not illegal. We recognize the legitimacy of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Said the Syrian Golan Heights that Israel took over, that's part of Israel now. Moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. All these things are in complete and total violation of international law and show complete and total disregard for Palestinian rights. And so he moved policy in a worse direction. And he picked a couple of people who were kind of driving policy. One is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's personal friends with Benjamin Netanyahu. And apparently when he was a child, Benjamin Netanyahu, when he would visit his family, would sleep in his bed and so on. So like very, very close relationship with an extremist right-wing government in Israel. And worse, the guy he appointed as his ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is just an all-out religious fanatic by any measure of that word. He accused Obama of being anti-Israel because Obama barely tepidly tried to be kind of even-handed in some cases, but not really. He accuses American Jewish organizations like J Street. J Street, by the way, is a pro-Israel organization, but they also think that Palestinians ought to have a state. He accused them of being capos. He compared them to Nazi collaborators because they recognize some Palestinian rights. Putting that guy in charge of policy and making him the ambassador to Israel was obviously a signal that things are going to move in a far, far worse direction. And he gets credit for what people describe as the Abraham Accords. They call them peace deals, and they're not peace deals. Those deals were between governments that are already quietly allied with the US and Israel, declaring those alliances publicly in exchange for military and financial incentives. That's what that was. And we made a big thing about it of, Trump brought peace to the Middle East. There was never war between these people. Like where's the conflict that was resolved? If anything, it isolated the Palestinians even further, because prior to that, the entire Arab League took the position that we will only recognize Israel and fully normalize relations with them if Israel fully ends the occupation and allows a Palestinian state to exist. That was their position. Trump peeled individual countries away from that, and so he was further isolating Palestinians. And in my view, that made the events of October 7th all the more likely, that when Palestinians are squeezed, that feel like the entire world is abandoning them, including allies of theirs, and that they're going to be stuck living without rights forever, that dramatically increases the possibility of a violent reaction. And I don't think that it's a stretch to tie Trump to the fact that this happened. And he likes to brag, as he brags about everything. It's like, if it were for me, none of this would have happened and this and that. But I think his policy did contribute to the fact that things became more desperate and created more despair among Palestinians, which therefore laid the groundwork for a much wider explosion that we've actually seen.
Omar, this has been wonderful. Where can people follow along with you?
For now, just on social media. I'm on Twitter or X at Omar Baddar, just my name, or on Instagram at Obadar. Those are the two primary channels, but people can just Google my name and find me on different social media as well.
I love it. Thank you, man, for taking the time. I appreciate it very much. Speaking of things I appreciate, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
There is an expression, a saying in the Islamic context: first we come for the Saturday people, then we come for the Sunday people. The Saturday people are the Jews, the Sunday people are the Christians. I can link pretty much